When a ruthless gang targeted an elderly black woman, they thought it was just another easy hit, another victim too afraid to fight back. What they didn't know was that with one phone call to her son, their fate was sealed. Her son wasn't just any man. He was a ghost from wars no one spoke about, trained to eliminate threats with ruthless precision. Now, the enforcers, the corrupt officers protecting them, and the crime boss who thought he was untouchable would learn what happens when you push the wrong person too far. Before they could react, their empire would crumble, their safe houses would burn, and a city that had lived in fear for too long would finally rise. This isn't just about revenge, it's about one man's love for his mother that brought down an empire. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the city, stretching long shadows across cracked sidewalks and aging storefronts. The streets, once vibrant with neighbors greeting each other and children playing on porches, now carried an uneasy quiet beneath the weight of change. Regina Hawthorne stepped out of Harry Langston's barber shop, her coat draped over her arm, purse secured at her side. The smell of talcum powder and aftershave clung to her like a familiar embrace, a comforting contrast to the shifting city around her. Inside, men had gathered in their usual spots, some discussing sports, others shaking their heads at the latest headlines. Regina had never been just another customer there. She had taught half the men in that shop, had scolded them when they were boys, encouraged them when they were struggling, and reminded them what it meant to stand tall in a world that too often tried to push them down. Harry Langston, the shop's owner, wiped his hands on a striped towel, leaning against the counter with the casual authority of a man who had seen it all. His hair was nearly gone, his beard streaked with gray, but his voice still carried the same weight it had since they were kids. "You sure you don't want me to walk you home, Miss Hawthorne?" Harry asked, concern laced beneath his usual gruffness. Regina scoffed, shaking her head as she adjusted the strap of her purse. "Boy, I was walking these streets before you knew how to hold a straight razor. What makes you think I need an escort now?" The younger men in the shop chuckled, but Harry wasn't so easily dissuaded. "It ain't like it used to be, Regina. You know that." Regina gave him a look, sharp and unwavering. "Of course I do. But I won't start acting afraid just because the world expects me to. That's how you lose, Harry. You start cowering, and then they think they own you." Harry sighed, shaking his head. "Stubborn as ever. Strong as ever," she corrected, smoothing a hand over her graying curls. "You let these young men hear you talk like that. Next thing you know, they'll be the ones walking around like they don't own their own streets." She turned toward them now, casting a look that commanded attention. "The city don't belong to the ones tearing it apart. It belongs to the people willing to stand their ground." There were nods, murmurs of agreement, but Regina knew words only carried so far. Still, it mattered to say them. It mattered to remind them. She glanced back at Harry and softened, just a little. "Besides, it's just a few blocks." Harry exhaled, rubbing a hand over his bald head. "You need anything, you call. I mean it." Regina patted his arm before stepping toward the door. "You worry too much." Stepping outside, she let the evening warmth settle around her. The sun was still lingering, casting a honeyed glow over the tops of buildings, but the streetlights had already begun to flicker on, their hum filling the quiet spaces between distant sirens and murmured conversations. She walked with purpose, the way she always had. She had never let fear dictate her steps, had never been the kind of woman to shrink herself to fit the comfort of others. Her body had slowed over the years, but her will had not. She was a black woman, a teacher, a woman who had built herself brick by brick and refused to be torn down by the creeping tide of violence that had claimed so many corners of this city. And yet, even with all her certainty, she felt them before she saw them. The shift in the air, the low murmur of voices behind her, the kind of laughter that didn't carry warmth, but something colder, something edged. She didn't stop walking, didn't turn her head, but she listened. They weren't rushing. Not yet. They were watching, waiting. "Yo, look at this one," a voice muttered. "Young? Cocky? She's too old to be out here like this," another said, laughter in his tone. "Yeah," the first voice answered, louder now, for her to hear. "Lady, you shouldn't be walking around alone." Regina kept moving. She had been in classrooms with boys like these before, boys with too much to prove, boys who hadn't yet learned that strength wasn't in how loud you spoke, but in how well you carried yourself. She had faced worse than this. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said without breaking stride, her voice even. One of them laughed. "Yeah? Trouble's looking for you." She still didn't turn, but she felt them getting closer. She tightened her grip on her purse, her jaw locking as she weighed her options. She had no intention of running, no intention of showing them fear. Her house wasn't far. If she just kept walking, if she just ignored them, maybe they would let it be nothing more than empty intimidation. But deep down, she knew better. Regina Hawthorne kept her pace steady, refusing to let the tension crawling up her spine show in her stride. She had walked these streets too many times to start acting afraid now. But she wasn't foolish either. She could hear them getting closer, their footsteps light and unhurried, the kind of confidence that came from knowing they had the upper hand. She had taught boys like them before, seen that restless hunger in their eyes, the kind that came from wanting to prove something, to themselves, to their peers, to a world that had already written them off. Some of them had been saved, had let her voice cut through the noise before it was too late. Others had been swallowed whole, lost to the streets, to the gangs that promised power, but delivered nothing but an early grave. Regina exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around the strap of her purse. The street ahead stretched out, empty, lined with flickering streetlights and the occasional rustle of wind against storefront awnings. Home wasn't far, just a few more blocks. One of the boys behind her whistled, sharp and mocking. "She actin' like she don't hear us." A chuckle followed, low and taunting. "She hear us." Regina didn't stop, didn't acknowledge them. That was what they wanted, for her to engage, to give them something to feed off, a few more steps. Just keep walking. But then she felt it, the shift, the moment when playfulness turned to something sharper, when the space between them disappeared faster than she could react. A hand clamped down on her shoulder, fingers pressing just hard enough to let her know she wasn't going anywhere, unless they allowed it. "Hold up, lady," the voice behind her said, all amusement gone now, replaced with something firmer. "We just want to talk." Regina stopped, not out of fear, but because she knew when a fight was already decided before it even began. There were 3 of them, and she was an elderly woman alone on a street where no one was going to intervene. If she fought, she would lose, and if she ran, she would fall before she ever got the chance. Slowly, she turned, keeping her expression neutral. The one holding her shoulder was young, early 20s at most, his hoodie half-zipped, a chain glinting against his collarbone. He had sharp features, the kind that hadn't yet been worn down by life, but carried the weight of someone who had already decided the world owed him something. His grip loosened slightly when she faced him fully, and she used the opportunity to pull herself free, stepping back just enough to reclaim her space, but not enough to provoke. "You've said what you wanted," she said, her voice as firm as it had ever been in a classroom filled with rowdy students. "Now let me be on my way." The boy on her left scoffed, shoving his hands into his pockets, his stance loose, but the tension in his frame unmistakable. "That's not how this works." The third one, younger than the rest, barely more than a boy, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his energy more nervous than aggressive. "Ain't nobody trying to hurt you, lady," he muttered, though he kept his eyes on the ground as he spoke. "Just be smart about it." Regina met his gaze, something flickering behind her own. Recognition. He had been one of hers, hadn't he? A long time ago, in one of her classrooms, back when he had still had choices. She inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. "Tyrell," she said, and the boy's head snapped up like he had been struck. "That's your name, isn't it?" The older one, the leader, stiffened. Nah, lady. He goes by TK now. Regina kept her gaze on Tyrell. She knew that name, knew that face, even if time and hardship had tried to change it. She had graded his papers, had scolded him for falling asleep in class, had once told him that he could be something if he wanted to. She saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the momentary crack in his armor, but it was gone just as fast as it had appeared. I remember you, she continued, her voice unwavering, and I remember your mother. She worked too damn hard for you to be out here doing this. The leader stepped in closer, a smirk curling on his lips. That's sweet. She got a speech for you, TK. You gonna let an old woman school you in the middle of the street? Tyrell's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. But he didn't move. The leader turned back to Regina, his amusement flickering into something colder. Listen, lady, you can talk all you want, but talking don't change nothing. What changes things is money. What changes things is knowing who's in charge out here. He gestured vaguely around them, to the city that had let them become what they were. And you're just another person walking around like this place still belongs to you? Like you're untouchable. Regina's spine straightened, her gaze unflinching. You think because you've got the numbers, because you've got the power in this moment, that you own these streets, that people like me don't matter anymore? She took a slow step forward, looking him straight in the eyes. You don't know how wrong you are. There was a moment of stillness, the kind that stretched between two opposing forces, neither willing to move first. Then, the leader clicked his tongue and chuckled, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe the audacity of the woman in front of him. He looked at his crew, then back at her, a new decision forming behind his eyes. Well, he said, voice casual, but his eyes sharp. Let's see how much you matter when we take what's yours. Regina knew then. The robbery wasn't a question anymore. It was coming, but she didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She had made them look her in the eye, had made one of them remember who he had been before the streets had claimed him. And if she couldn't stop what was about to happen, at least she could make damn sure they knew she wasn't just another victim. Regina Hawthorne had always believed in the power of standing tall, of meeting adversity with the same unwavering resolve that had carried her through decades of teaching, through the struggles of raising a family, through the losses that life had thrown at her without warning. She had always understood that the world could be cruel, but she had never once allowed herself to be cowed by it. Even now, as she stood with her spine straight, her breath measured, and her heart steady in the face of the boys who thought they could take from her, she did not yield. But defiance alone had never been enough to stop the tide. She saw it in the eyes of the one who had spoken first, the one who carried himself with the kind of authority that only came from knowing he had never been challenged in a way that truly mattered. He was already bored of the exchange, already dismissing her words as nothing more than the empty noise of someone who didn't understand the world he lived in. He had come to a decision, and there was nothing left to do but follow through. She barely had time to react before his hand shot out again, this time gripping her purse with more force than before. She twisted away, clutching it tightly against her body, refusing to let it go without a fight. She wasn't naive enough to believe she could overpower him, but she also wasn't the kind of woman who let anything go without resistance. Don't be stupid, lady, he muttered, his voice losing the last traces of amusement as he yanked harder, using his full strength. Regina braced herself, planting her feet, tightening her grip, but it was no use. The leather strap cut into her hand, burning against her skin as she struggled, her nails digging into it. But the boy was young, and she was not. And with one final vicious tug, he tore it from her grasp, the force of it sending her staggering backward. She managed to stay upright for only a second, before another set of hands shoved her hard from behind. The world lurched violently, the pavement rushing up to meet her before she could stop herself. Her knees scraped against the rough ground, pain bursting through her hip and shoulder as she hit the concrete, the impact rattling through her bones. Laughter echoed around her, cold and cruel, a sound that made her stomach turn, more than the pain did. She really thought she could fight back, one of them muttered, shaking his head. Regina pressed her palms against the ground, fingers stinging from the scrape, her breath coming sharp and unsteady. But she did not cry out. She did not beg. She tried to push herself up, but a sharp kick to her ribs sent her sprawling again, pain exploding in her side as the breath was forced from her lungs. Another kick landed, this time against her shoulder, jolting through her entire frame like a live wire, leaving a deep, aching throb in its wake. She could hear them still laughing, their words barely registering past the ringing in her ears, past the pulsing pain radiating through every nerve in her body. Then there was a pause, a shift in the air, followed by a low whistle of appreciation. "Check this out," the leader murmured, crouching beside her. She could see him now, just out of the corner of her eye, his fingers reaching for her left hand. She knew before he even touched her what he was after. She closed her fingers, curling them tight into her palm, fighting to keep it from him, but he was stronger, prying them open with little effort, forcing her fingers apart with the kind of ease that made her stomach turn. "Nice ring," he said, turning it between his fingers as if it was nothing more than a trinket. "Bet this got some history." Regina swallowed, her throat burning, her breath still shallow from the blows, but she forced the words out anyway, her voice rasping but steady. "Please." It was not for herself. It was not for pride. It was for the memory of the man who had slipped that ring onto her finger so many years ago, the man who had loved her through every hardship, who had stood beside her when the world felt too heavy, who had left a part of himself with her in that simple band of gold. The leader didn't even look at her when he slipped it into his pocket. He stood, rolling his shoulders, as if none of it mattered, as if this was nothing more than another night, another easy win. Regina remained where she was, lying against the pavement, feeling the weight of her body pressing into the unforgiving concrete. The pain would pass. The bruises would heal. The cuts would close. But none of that was what truly mattered. She would remember this moment, not for the pain, not for the humiliation, but for what it had set in motion. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps approached. A voice called her name, filled with concern, laced with worry. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see a familiar figure rushing toward her. James Parker, the man who had lived in the house 2 doors down from hers for over 20 years, the man who had helped her late husband fix their fence one summer, the man who had never once hesitated to step in when someone in the neighborhood needed something, dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering, unsure whether to touch her, afraid of making things worse. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "What happened? Who did this to you?" She exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the pavement, forcing herself up despite the protest of every muscle in her body. "They took my purse," she said, her voice measured, her hands steady despite the tremor in her ribs. "And my ring." James reached out, his grip firm but careful as he helped her to her feet, his expression darkening, his jaw tightening. "Come on, let's get you home." She nodded, allowing him to guide her, her steps slow, her body aching, but her mind sharper than it had ever been. They thought they had won tonight. They thought they had taken something from her. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. James Parker's grip was firm but careful as he helped Regina Hawthorne up the steps to her front door. She gritted her teeth through the pain radiating from her ribs and hip, refusing to let it show, refusing to let the night have that power over her. James had offered to take her to the hospital, had suggested calling the police, but she had dismissed both with a quiet, resolute shake of her head. She knew how that would go. The police would show up, take a statement, nod their heads, and drive off. They wouldn't patrol her neighborhood with urgency, wouldn't turn the city upside down to find the boys who had done this. Even if they caught them, she had no illusions about what would come next. Those boys would be back on the street in days, laughing about the old woman they had knocked down, showing off the ring they had stolen, moving on to the next easy target. But she was not an easy target. James exhaled, his voice thick with anger as he unlocked her door for her and guided her inside. "Miss Hawthorne, you need to let me do something. You shouldn't be alone right now." Regina, steadying herself against the back of her living room chair, inhaled slowly and forced a small, weary smile. "I've been alone before, James. This won't be the thing that breaks me." He stood there for a moment, his lips pressed into a hard line, the frustration clear in the way his fingers flexed at his sides. He was younger than her by a couple of decades, but old enough to remember when this neighborhood had been different, when people didn't hesitate to sit on their porches late into the night, when mothers didn't worry about their children disappearing into the grip of gangs that had spread like a sickness. He had seen what had happened to the city, and he hated it as much as she did. "Call someone at least," he muttered. "You got family?" Regina's fingers tightened around the chair's wooden frame. "I do." She saw the flicker of relief cross his face, but he didn't know. He didn't understand what she meant. He thought she would call a daughter, a sister, maybe an old friend from church. James had no idea what was about to happen next. "Thank you for walking me home," she said, the finality in her voice unmistakable. He sighed, running a hand over his head before nodding. "You need anything, you call me. I mean it." She watched him leave, his frustration still simmering in the air, and only when she heard the door click shut behind him did she allow herself to exhale, slow and deliberate. She was hurting. Her ribs ached, her palms stung, and her left hip throbbed from where it had collided with the pavement. But all of that faded into the background as she walked toward the small wooden table by her armchair, the one that held a framed photo of her late husband, David. She sat down carefully, reaching for the phone with fingers that had steadied despite the pain. She had never wanted to make this call. The number was still saved in her phone, though it had been years since she had last dialed it. She had never needed to. She had spent most of her life solving her own problems, fighting her own battles. She had raised her son to do the same, but this wasn't about pride. This was about what came next. The line rang twice before a voice answered, deep and measured. The same voice she had known since the day he was born. "Ma?" Regina inhaled slowly, letting the sound of his voice settle over her like a balm against the evening's wounds. He didn't sound rushed. He didn't sound worried. He sounded the way he always did, controlled, steady, waiting. "Zion," she said, using the name she had given him, the name only she still called him, though the world had come to know him as Zion. "I need you to listen to me, baby." A pause. Not long. Just enough for him to recognize something in her tone, something she hadn't let him hear before. "I'm listening." She closed her eyes, not to block out the pain, but to keep her voice even as she spoke. "I was coming home from Harry's shop. 3 of them followed me, boys too young to be doing what they're doing. They shoved me to the ground, kicked me, took my purse," she didn't say, "and my ring just yet." Not because she wanted to spare him, but because she knew the weight those words would carry. There was silence on the other end. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady, the same way it had been when he was a boy, when he had learned to count each breath before a fight, before a test, before stepping onto a football field. He had always been that way, measured, in control. But she knew what was happening on the other side of that phone. She knew what was coiling inside him, pressing against the surface, waiting for an outlet. "Did they hurt you?" She exhaled through her nose. "I'll heal." "That's not what I asked." She didn't answer right away. Because yes, they had hurt her. But she knew that the way she answered would determine what happened next. She didn't want to lie to her son. She never had. But she also didn't want him to hear her say it out loud, didn't want to give him the confirmation that she knew would send him hurtling down a path that couldn't be undone. So she settled for the truth, the only version of it she could give. "I'll be fine," she said. The silence stretched longer this time, and for the first time in years, she wished she could see his face. "I'm coming home." His voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It didn't waver. "Zion, I'm coming home." She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, letting the words settle deep in her chest. knowing there was no stopping him now. There was no pleading with him, no convincing him otherwise, and maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to. Her son had spent his life fighting for others, for a country that had sent him into battles he hadn't always believed in, for people who had never even known his name. And yet, the one thing he had never been able to fight for was this city, this family, this home. Now, that fight had come for him. "Stay home, Ma," he said, his voice still calm, still controlled. "I'll be there soon." The line went dead. Regina placed the phone back onto the table, her fingers resting against the cool surface for a moment before she looked back at the photo of David. She sighed, shaking her head. Lord help them. She knew what was coming, and she knew those boys had no idea what they had just done. The plane touched down just after noon, the heat rising from the tarmac in waves as the engines hummed into stillness. Zion Hawthorne remained seated, his fingers interlaced, his posture relaxed, but beneath that stillness was something coiled, something that had been waiting for release from the moment he answered his mother's call. The airport was busy, people moving with purpose, conversations blending into a low hum of background noise. He barely heard any of it. His thoughts were ahead of him, already walking these streets, already scanning these faces, already hunting. He stepped outside and slid into the back seat of a waiting cab, giving the driver his mother's address. The man, older, with the weary eyes of someone who had seen the city change in ways he didn't like, hesitated before pulling away from the curb. "You visiting family?" the driver asked, his voice polite but carrying an edge of something else, something cautious. Zion didn't immediately answer. He watched the city slide past the window, his gaze sharp, dissecting every street corner, every group of young men huddled in conversation, every block that seemed quieter than it should have been. This was not the home he remembered. "Something like that," he finally said, his voice even. The driver nodded, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel as they idled at a red light. Across the intersection, a group of young men stood outside a convenience store, their movements slow but deliberate, their eyes darting toward the cab before turning away. They weren't loitering for the sake of it. They were watching, measuring, controlling. Zion had seen it before. Different country, same rules. Neighborhoods changed. The driver muttered under his breath. Zion barely glanced at him. "Yeah, so I've heard." The rest of the ride was silent, but the city spoke to him in ways words never could. The storefronts were tagged over with symbols that had meaning to the right people. The sidewalks lined with men who weren't standing there just to pass time. The fear was subtle, but it was there, woven into the way people moved, the way their eyes flickered away too quickly, the way conversations cut short when unfamiliar faces passed by. When they finally pulled up in front of his mother's house, the driver lingered for a second before speaking again. "You be careful out here. This ain't the same city you left." Zion met his gaze in the mirror, holding it for a beat before nodding. "Appreciate the ride." He stepped out, adjusting the strap of his duffel over his shoulder. The second his feet hit the pavement, he felt it, the weight of eyes on him. Oh. The old woman sitting on the porch across the street, clutching a newspaper, her lips pressed into a firm line as she watched him with recognition. The man walking his dog, his pace just a little too quick, his gaze flickering toward the house before shifting away. And then there were the others, a small cluster of men further down, their postures relaxed, but their conversation fading to a hush as they took him in. They weren't boys he recognized, but he knew their type. Zion didn't linger. He climbed the steps to his mother's porch, pushed the front door open, and stepped inside. The house smelled the same. Spices, worn wood, the faint lingering scent of his mother's perfume. It was a house that had never changed, that had remained untouched by time, even as the world outside it shifted into something unrecognizable. Regina Hawthorne was in her chair, a cup of tea resting beside her, her posture composed, but her eyes carrying something heavier than before. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, She set her cup down and rose to her feet. Zion. She was the only person in the world who still called him that. He crossed the room, careful but purposeful, and wrapped his arms around her. He could feel the slight stiffness in her frame, the hesitation in the way she leaned into him, not from uncertainty, but from pain. His jaw tightened as he pulled back, his eyes scanning her face, taking in the faint bruises, the way she moved with just a little too much caution. "Tell me," he said, his voice steady but edged with something simmering just beneath. She sighed, shaking her head, as if she had already made peace with the fact that he would not let this go. "You already know, baby. I want to hear it from you." She exhaled slowly, moving toward the kitchen, motioning for him to sit. "Eat first, then we talk." He dropped his duffel onto the floor, taking the chair across from her as she placed a plate in front of him. The food was warm, familiar, but he barely tasted it. He ate because she expected him to, because it was the one thing she could offer him right now. When the silence stretched long enough, she set her tea down again and looked at him the way only a mother could, her gaze unwavering. "They followed me, 3 of them, young. I knew what they wanted before they took it." Zion's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, but he didn't speak. "They shoved me, kicked me when I was down." Her voice remained steady, but her hands, resting against the table, betrayed a slight tremor. "Took my purse." Zion's breathing had not changed, but his entire body had gone still in the way that only came before action. She hesitated for just a moment, before she added, "And my ring." His hands flexed once, just a small movement, but it was enough for her to know what was coming next. "Zion," she warned, but his expression remained unreadable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, too quiet. "Do you know who they were?" She shook her head. "Does it matter?" His jaw clenched. "It matters." She studied him, sighing as she leaned back in her chair. "I need you to be careful." He met her gaze, unwavering. "I'll be careful." She didn't believe him. She never had when he said those words. She exhaled through her nose, her eyes scanning his face before she gave a slow, resigned nod. "What are you going to do?" Zion reached for his napkin, wiping his fingers, his movements precise, measured. When he finally looked back up, there was no hesitation in his expression. "I'm going to find them," he said, "and I'm going to make sure they understand exactly who they touched." Regina's fingers curled against her cup. She had always known this day might come, had always known that if the world ever forced her son's hand, he would not hesitate. She sighed, shaking her head as she murmured, "Lord, help them," because she knew what was coming next, and she knew those boys had no idea what they had just set in motion. Regina had always been a woman of resolve, a force of nature when she made up her mind about something. Zion Hawthorne had seen that strength in her all his life, in the way she had fought for her students, in the way she had held their family together through loss, in the way she had never once backed down from what was right. But tonight, as she sat across from him at the kitchen table, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup, there was a different kind of determination in her gaze, one that he wasn't sure how to handle. He had expected fear, at least a trace of it. He had expected hesitation, maybe even a plea for him to let it go. But what he got instead was the same woman who had scolded him as a child for getting into fights, the same woman who had taught him to stand tall but had never once let him believe that strength was measured only in fists. "You want to find them," Regina said, her voice even, her eyes locked onto his. "I do too." Zion leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. He had already decided what needed to be done, had already mapped out his next steps, had already set himself on the path that would take him to the boys who had dared to put their hands on his mother. What he hadn't accounted for was her wanting a say in it. "I don't need your help with this, Ma," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I just need to know if you recognize them, anything that'll point me in the right direction." Regina exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup. "I told you. I didn't—" She stopped, her lips pressing together as something shifted in her expression. A memory, a name, a face. She set her tea down carefully, her fingers steady despite the bruises along her knuckles. "I do know them," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "And I know one thing." Zion waited, his patience unshaken. "They'll come again," she continued. "Same neighborhood. Same mindset. They got away with it once. They'll think they can do it again. And if there's one thing I've learned about men who take what isn't theirs, it's that they never stop at one." Zion's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers flexing against the edge of the table. He knew she was right. He had seen it time and again in places far worse than this city. Had spent years tracking men who thrived off weakness, who fed off fear, who kept coming until someone made them stop. But that didn't mean he liked where she was going with this. "They're not ghosts, Ma. I don't need to lure them out. I'll find them." Regina held his gaze, unwavering. "And what if you don't? What if they find someone else first? Someone who doesn't have you to come running?" He didn't answer right away. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering but not losing an ounce of its weight. "I may be old, but I'm not scared. Not when I have you." His chest tightened at that. She had never been one for dramatics, had never used words to manipulate, never wielded guilt like a weapon. But there was something about the quiet truth in her statement that struck deeper than any plea ever could. He sighed, running a hand over his beard before shaking his head. "What exactly are you proposing?" Regina leaned back, folding her arms in a way that told him she had already worked this out long before he had even set foot in this house. "I borrow a necklace, a valuable one. I take the same route I did that night, and I wait." Zion's hand curled into a loose fist against the table. "And when they come?" A slow, knowing smile tugged at her lips. "That's when you do what you do best." He exhaled sharply. Not quite a laugh, not quite frustration. Somewhere in between. He had walked into war zones with less hesitation than he was feeling now. It wasn't that he didn't believe in his mother's strength. He did, with every part of him. But he also knew the kind of men that had taken over this city. "They won't come alone," he said finally. "They'll be watching, waiting, maybe even testing you to see if you're worth the risk. If they see anything out of place, anything that doesn't sit right, they'll scatter, and we'll be back to square one." Regina nodded, already ahead of him. "Then we make sure nothing seems out of place." He sighed, rubbing his temples, knowing there was no winning this argument. "And where exactly are you getting this necklace?" "A friend of mine, Evelyn, has a daughter who married well," Regina said, a glint of amusement flickering through her eyes. "A few years back, she bought herself something expensive and flashy for a gala, and she's hardly worn it since. When I told Evelyn what happened, she was more than happy to loan it to me." Zion raised an eyebrow. "She knows what you're using it for?" Regina took another sip of her tea. "She knows I'm making sure no other woman in this neighborhood has to go through what I did." He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, rolling the idea over in his mind. Every instinct in him told him this was a bad idea, that he should be the one walking those streets, that he should be the bait, that putting her in harm's way was something he could never allow. But he also knew his mother. She had made up her mind, and no amount of reasoning was going to change it. Finally, he nodded once, accepting what he couldn't control. "Fine. But I'll be watching. The second something doesn't feel right, we shut it down." She gave him a look, one that said she had already assumed that much. "Of course, baby." He shook his head, running a hand over his beard again, a habit she recognized as his way of steadying himself when things weren't sitting right. "Tomorrow night, then. Just after sunset. We'll do it exactly the way it happened before. No variations, no changes." Regina smiled, slow and knowing. "Then I suppose I should get some rest. I have a big day tomorrow." Zion stood, collecting their plates, shaking his head as he muttered, "Unbelievable." Regina chuckled softly, rising from her chair. "That's what you get for having a mother who raised you to be fearless." He paused, looking at her, something unspoken passing between them. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he murmured, "I guess I do." The city breathed differently at night. The air, still thick with the warmth of the day, carried an edge of something sharper, an undercurrent of unspoken rules, of quiet threats lurking beneath the surface. Regina Hawthorne walked at her usual pace, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. Her presence a deliberate challenge to the night itself. She could feel them before she heard them, the weight of their attention pressed against her back, a quiet calculation taking place just beyond the edges of her vision. They weren't rushing. They weren't careless. They moved with the patience of men who believed they had control of the situation before it had even begun. The leader was the first to speak, his voice low, confident, full of the kind of arrogance that came from never having faced a true consequence in his life. "Look at this," he murmured, more to his crew than to her. She walking around like nothing happened. The second one, younger, meaner, let out a quiet scoff. "Old lady don't learn." Regina kept her stride even, her eyes forward, her breath steady. She had spent years in classrooms filled with boys just like them, had seen the same bravado, the same desperate need to be seen as more dangerous than they truly were. But there had always been a difference between play acting and what came after the moment they crossed the wrong line. She could hear their steps falling in sync with hers now, feel the way they were closing the space between them inch by inch. They wanted her to feel it, to recognize that she was cornered, that there was nowhere left to go. The leader moved first, veering into her path, his head tilting slightly as if examining her. "That's a real nice necklace," he said, letting his gaze flicker down to the gold resting against her collarbone. "Looks expensive." Regina met his eyes without hesitation, her voice measured, unreadable. "It is." His smirk widened, his fingers flexing at his sides. "That's so. Might be safer if you let me hold on to it. You know, just to make sure nothing happens to it." Regina exhaled, slow and steady. "You boys don't think past the moment, do you?" The leader blinked, something shifting in his expression for just a second before he forced the smirk back into place. "You think you're smarter than us, lady?" His voice had changed, just slightly, the first crack in the mask of control. Regina tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "I think you made a mistake last time, and I think you're about to make a worse one." For the first time, he hesitated. Not much, not enough for his crew to notice, but Regina noticed, because deep down he could feel it too. The change in the air, the invisible shift in balance. Something was wrong, and he didn't know what yet. But arrogance was a powerful thing, and he had no intention of backing down. "Hold her," he muttered to one of his men. "I'm taking that chain." The second one moved fast, his hand darting toward Regina's arm. But that was the moment everything unraveled. Because before his fingers could even graze the fabric of her sleeve, the shadows behind them came to life. Zion struck like a ghost emerging from the dark, his presence sudden and absolute, the air shifting with the sheer force of controlled violence. His first strike was a calculated dismantling, his grip locking onto the wrist of the man reaching for Regina and twisting it so violently that the sharp, sickening crack of bone echoed against the alley walls. A strangled cry burst from the gang member's throat as his knees buckled beneath him, his other hand instinctively reaching for the damaged limb. Zion didn't give him the chance to recover. He pivoted smoothly, driving an elbow into the man's ribs with the kind of precision that shattered air from lungs and left no room for resistance. The gang member collapsed, coughing, gasping, his hand cradling his ruined wrist. Everything shifted in an instant. The second one lunged, moving on instinct rather than thought, his arms swinging in a wide arc. Zion didn't flinch. He sidestepped effortlessly, letting the punch slice through empty space before delivering a brutal knee to the man's gut. The impact sent the second attacker stumbling back, his entire body curling inward from the force, his breath coming in sharp, pained wheezes. Regina stood exactly where she had been, untouched, unmoved, watching her son dismantle them piece by piece, with the same efficiency she had always known was inside him. The leader took a single stumbling step backward, his bravado slipping like water through his fingers. He had seen street fights before, had thrown his fair share of punches, had been on both the winning and losing ends of a brawl. But this was different. Zion didn't fight like someone from these streets. He fought like someone who had seen the inside of war, like someone who had walked through places where men died without a sound, where violence wasn't about dominance, but survival. The leader realized it too late. "Who the hell?" he started. But Zion was already moving. A single, brutal step closed the distance between them, and before the gang leader could react, Zion's hand shot out, gripping the front of his hoodie and yanking him forward with terrifying ease. The gang leader barely had time to suck in a breath before his back collided with the nearest brick wall, the impact forcing a strangled sound from his throat. Zion didn't let go. He kept him pinned, his grip ironclad, his breathing calm. "You touched my mother," Zion said, his voice quiet, so quiet it was more terrifying than a scream. The gang leader twitched, his hands grappling at Zion's wrist, trying to pry himself free. I didn't know." "Shut up," Zion said simply. His grip tightened, his knuckles going white against the fabric. The leader's breath stuttered, his pulse thundering against his throat as the reality of the situation began to set in. He wasn't in control. He had never been in control. Regina, still standing where she had started, didn't move. She didn't need to. She had told them they had made a mistake. Now, they were starting to understand just how big of one it had been, and Zion wasn't finished yet. The lesson had only just begun. The gang leader's body was trembling beneath Zion's grip, his back pressed hard against the brick wall, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. His hands still gripped at Zion's wrist in a feeble attempt to pry himself free, but there was no strength left in him. The arrogance had drained from his eyes, replaced with something raw and primal, fear. Regina stood just a few feet away, unmoving, composed, watching with the same steady patience she had always carried. She had warned them that they had made a mistake. Now, they were beginning to understand just how deep of a mistake it had been. But the night wasn't done with them yet. Zion barely had time to shift his stance before he heard footsteps pounding against the pavement from deeper in the alley. More were coming, drawn by the commotion, by the shattered confidence of their fallen friends. The first one to charge was big, built like a man who had spent his life throwing his weight around, expecting it to be enough to win every fight he started. His fist was already swinging before he had even fully closed the distance, his entire body moving with brute force rather than precision. Zion sidestepped smoothly, letting the man's momentum carry him forward before striking, driving a sharp elbow straight into the attacker's exposed ribs. The force of the blow stole the air from his lungs, but Zion didn't stop there. Before the man could recover, Zion pivoted, grabbing the back of his head and slamming his face into the nearest brick wall. The wet crunch of cartilage breaking filled the air as blood splattered against the bricks. The man crumpled, his body limp before he even hit the ground. The second one was faster, younger, more agile. He didn't charge in blindly. He feinted first, testing Zion's reactions, looking for an opening. But he wasn't fast enough. Zion let him think he had an opening, waiting until the moment the man committed to a full strike before stepping inside his reach. His hands locked onto the attacker's arm, twisting it at an unnatural angle, using his own weight against him. The gang member let out a sharp, agonized scream as his elbow hyperextended, the joint popping violently. Zion finished it with a knee to the gut, sending him collapsing onto the pavement, gasping for air. Another one came at him from behind, this one smarter, swinging a pipe aimed directly for the back of Zion's skull. Regina saw it first. "Zion!" Zion reacted instantly, dropping low just as the metal pipe cut through the air where his head had been seconds before. He twisted, grabbed the attacker's wrist, and with a single practiced motion, he snapped it cleanly at the joint, forcing the pipe to drop from limp fingers. The gang member howled in pain, but Zion was already moving again, catching the pipe before it hit the ground, and driving the end of it into the side of the attacker's knee. The man's leg buckled instantly, sending him down. Zion turned sharply, swinging the pipe in a wide arc, catching the second attacker across the ribs, the impact sending him sprawling against the alley wall with a heavy thud. And just like that, it was over. The alley was filled with groans, gasps, broken bodies writhing on the pavement, men who had believed themselves untouchable, now reduced to nothing but cautionary tales. The gang leader, still on his knees, still struggling to piece together what had just happened, lifted his head, his face twisted in something between pain and realization. Zion crouched down in front of him, his expression unreadable, his voice low and steady, free of emotion but heavy with certainty. "You're going to talk," Zion said. The gang leader shook his head weakly, his lips parting, but no words came. He still thought there might be a way out of this. Zion didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man's already bruised hand, fingers closing around his pinky, and twisted. A sharp, piercing snap rang through the alley. The gang leader screamed, his body jerking violently, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "I can keep going," Zion said, his voice calm, so calm it was terrifying. "Or you can tell me what I want to know." The gang leader trembled, his head shaking. I don't know what you—" Another snap. Another scream. Zion didn't blink. "I don't have patience for lies." The man's breathing hitched, his entire body shuddering beneath Zion's grip. And then, finally, he broke. "Novak," he gasped, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. "Victor Novak." Regina stiffened at the name, her expression darkening ever so slightly. Zion's grip tightened. Novak. Zion had heard the name before, spoken in whispers, muttered in places where men feared their words would be traced back to them. Victor Novak wasn't just a gang leader. He was the one who sat at the top, the man who controlled the streets with an iron grip, the one who had turned this city into his personal empire. Zion released the man's broken hand, letting him slump back onto the ground, clutching his injured fingers to his chest. He no longer mattered. He was just another pawn Novak had left in his wake, another casualty of a game he had thought he was playing alone. Regina stepped closer, her voice steady. "You sure?" Zion exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. "Yeah." He turned his gaze back to the gang leader. "Where do I find him?" The gang leader shook his head frantically. I don't know, man, I swear. Novak don't just meet with people. He keeps himself locked down, tight security, only deals with his top guys." Zion considered that for a moment, his expression giving nothing away. And then, finally, he stood. Regina looked at her son, searching his face. "What now?" Zion reached into his pocket, pulling out a phone. "Now?" He glanced down at the gang leader one last time. "Now, I make some noise," because Novak was going to hear him coming. And when he did, there wouldn't be anywhere left for him to hide. Zion had learned long ago that real war wasn't about chaos. It wasn't about blind rage or reckless violence. It was about control, about understanding the board before making a move, about making sure that when you struck, it wasn't just to hurt. It was to dismantle, to strip your enemy down piece by piece until they had nowhere left to stand. Victor Novak ruled this city's underworld like a king with a throne built from fear and blood. But even kings needed men to carry out their orders. Those men, the lieutenants, the enforcers, the ones who kept the streets in line for him, they were the ones Zion would take first. Not with noise, not with reckless aggression, but methodically, strategically, surgically. Novak wouldn't see him coming. Miguel Rivas was not a fighter. He was a businessman, a middleman who played a crucial role in moving money, drugs, and influence for Victor Novak. But he wasn't untouchable. He surrounded himself with men who did his dirty work, enforcers who made sure he never had to get his hands bloody. That was his weakness. He believed that protection meant security, that having others fight for him meant he didn't have to know how to fight for himself. Zion was about to show him how wrong he was. He had watched Rivas for nights, learning his patterns, his safe zones, his paranoia levels. The man never went anywhere alone, except for one place. At exactly 1:15 a.m. every night, Rivas left a well-secured club and made a short walk to a private poker lounge hidden in a back alleyway, a place where only trusted players were allowed in. His bodyguards never went inside with him. They waited out front, watching the street, assuming that because the lounge was exclusive, no one inside posed a threat. They were wrong. Zion was already inside when Rivas arrived. He had been sitting in a dark corner, his back to the wall, his posture relaxed, but his senses sharp, absorbing the layout, the exits, the way the men inside moved. The second Rivas walked in, he sized him up in an instant. A short, stocky man with too much gold on his fingers and a smirk that barely hid the nervous twitch of someone who had spent his life buying loyalty instead of earning it. Rivas didn't notice him at first. He walked to his usual table, greeting the dealer with a lazy nod, flashing his teeth in the false confidence of a man who had never been truly afraid before. That was about to change. Zion waited until the dealer shuffled the first hand before he moved. He didn't go for Rivas immediately. He walked toward the bar first, slow and casual, letting his presence settle into the background noise of the room, the sound of clinking chips, muffled laughter, the occasional curse over a bad hand. It all blended together into a scene Rivas had walked into 100 times before. He didn't know this was the last time. Zion reached the bar, resting a hand lightly on the edge, leaning in just enough to get the bartender's attention. "Whiskey?" "Neat," the bartender nodded, but his hand never reached for the bottle, because in that same moment, Zion moved. He pivoted sharply, grabbing the back of Rivas's chair and yanking it backward with a violent pull. Rivas went down hard, his body slamming against the floor, his breath leaving him in a sharp gasp of shock. Cards and chips scattered across the table, drinks spilled, voices raised in sudden confusion. Zion didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, grabbing Rivas by the collar and dragging him up before slamming him down against the table with enough force to rattle everything on it. The room froze. Rivas let out a sharp, choked sound, his hands scrambling for purchase, his mind catching up to the reality that he wasn't in control. Zion leaned in close, his voice quiet but firm, meant only for Rivas to hear. "Outside, your men are waiting. They think you're safe in here." His grip tightened, pressing down just enough to let Rivas feel the helplessness sinking in. "You're not." Rivas gasped for air, his eyes wide with disbelief. Who the hell?" Zion slammed his head against the table again, cutting off whatever weak protest had been forming. A glass shattered from the impact, pieces of it embedding into the wooden surface. The tension in the room thickened, the other players staring, their hands half raised as if they weren't sure whether to intervene or stay out of it. No one moved. Zion pulled Rivas upright just enough to spin him around and send him stumbling toward the back exit. He kept a tight grip on his collar, steering him through the stunned silence, pushing past tables as players scrambled out of the way. The second they hit the alley, Rivas tried to fight. He was clumsy, wild, lashing out with the desperation of a man who had never thrown a real punch in his life. Zion caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it violently. The sound of tendons straining filled the narrow space, followed by Rivas's sharp scream. "You're going to tell me what I want to know," Zion murmured, pushing him back against the damp brick wall. "Or I'm going to start taking pieces of you apart." Rivas's chest heaved, his body trembling, but his pride hadn't broken yet. "I ain't saying—" Zion didn't let him finish. He drove a fist into Rivas's stomach, a sharp, precise strike aimed right below the ribs. The smaller man gagged, his knees buckling, his body folding over Zion's arm as his breath came in wheezing gasps. Zion didn't let go. He yanked him upright again, this time grabbing a fistful of hair, forcing him to look him in the eyes. "Names," Zion said, his voice colder this time. "Give me Novak's lieutenants." Rivas coughed, his breath shuddering. I don't—" Zion drove his knee up, smashing it into Rivas's ribs. A sharp crack followed. "One, maybe 2 ribs breaking under the force of the impact. Rivas screamed, his body sagging, but Zion held him upright, kept him awake, kept him feeling every second of the lesson he was being taught. "You've got one chance," Zion warned, his voice dangerously even. "Tell me where Novak's power starts, or I make sure you never walk out of this alley." This time, when Rivas coughed, it was wet, tinged with something deeper than just pain. His head lolled slightly, but he forced himself to lift it, his fear finally overriding his false bravado. His lips trembled before the words spilled out like a confession at gunpoint. "Dominic!" he gasped. "Dom Varela. He's Novak's muscle. He controls the weapons, the shipments. He's the one who enforces everything." Zion nodded once, absorbing the information. Then, with one final calculated motion, he let go of Rivas, just long enough to slam him face first against the brick wall. The man slumped to the ground, unconscious, blood pooling beneath him. Zion stepped back, rolling his shoulders, already thinking about the next name on his list. One down. And Novak had no idea what was coming next. Zion had always known that a war wasn't won in a single battle, that taking down an empire built on fear and blood required precision, strategy, and the kind of patience that could break a man long before he ever realized he had lost. Miguel Rivas had been the easy part, a soft, spoiled man who had relied on money and influence to keep himself safe, never once believing that the walls he had built around himself could come crashing down in an instant. But Dominic Varela was different. A man who had built his name not through whispered deals or backroom exchanges, but with his fists, his brutality, and the unshakable reputation of someone who had never lost a fight that mattered. That was why Zion had spent 3 nights learning every detail of Dom's routines, memorizing the ways he moved, the places he considered safe, the people who surrounded him at all times. Unlike Rivas, Dom didn't hide behind luxury. He thrived in violence, ruled by it, carried himself like a warlord patrolling his kingdom, certain that no one in this city would dare challenge him. He was a man who killed for pleasure as much as for business. And if there was one thing Zion had learned from years of tracking men like him, it was that every beast, no matter how untouchable, had a moment of vulnerability. For Dom, that moment came in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, a place where Novak's men stored shipments of stolen military-grade weapons before they were smuggled to buyers who didn't care where they came from as long as they could kill. The factory was a fortress of metal and concrete, watched by men who had seen enough bloodshed to know that their lives depended on keeping Dom safe. But Zion didn't intend to go through them. He intended to carve through them, one by one, leaving nothing but silence in his wake, until there was no one left standing between him and the monster he had come for. The first guard never saw him coming. A hand clamped over his mouth, a knife driving upward between his ribs. Quick, efficient, the life draining from his body before he even had a chance to reach for his radio. The second barely had time to turn before Zion's arm wrapped around his throat. The struggle brief, his body going limp in the shadows. Gunfire erupted from deeper inside the warehouse. Zion had been waiting for it. The moment the first bullet tore through the air, he was already moving, weaving between rusted machinery, closing the distance before the gunman had a chance to coordinate. He caught one mid-reload, twisting the rifle from his grasp before slamming the butt of the weapon into his jaw with bone-breaking force. Another turned, raising his pistol. But Zion was faster, grabbing the barrel and redirecting the shot before twisting his wrist at an unnatural angle. The crack of breaking bones lost beneath the chaos of the fight. Dom was watching, standing at the far end of the room, arms folded across his broad chest, a smirk curling at the edges of his scarred lips, as if he was enjoying the show. As if this wasn't the inevitable end of his empire unraveling before his eyes. He didn't move as Zion tore through his men, didn't flinch when the last of them hit the ground with a final pained grunt, their bodies littering the concrete in broken, gasping heaps. Then, finally, he stepped forward. "You got guts," Dom said, rolling his shoulders, the thick muscle in his arms flexing as he cracked his knuckles, the low, hungry grin of a man who had never known fear spreading across his face. "I'll give you that." Zion exhaled slowly, blood dripping from a cut above his eyebrow, the warmth of it trickling down his cheek, the pain in his ribs, a dull throb from where a lucky shot had grazed him earlier. It didn't matter. He had fought through worse. "You talk too much," he muttered, adjusting his stance, waiting, knowing that men like Dom didn't go down easy, that this wasn't going to end with a single well-placed strike, but with a war fought between two bodies refusing to break. Dom laughed, low and dangerous, before he lunged. The first punch was a hammer, a blow meant to end a fight before it even began. The kind of raw, explosive power that had broken men in half before they even realized they had lost. Zion dodged, slipping just out of range, his counter quick, precise, a sharp jab aimed at the liver, meant to test more than hurt. Dom barely reacted. The second swing came even faster, forcing Zion back as Dom pressed forward, relentless, his size and strength making him a living wrecking ball with nothing to lose. Zion moved with it, waiting, watching, letting Dom burn himself out. But then, a mistake. A half-second too slow. The fist caught him in the ribs, sending a shockwave of pain ripping through his body, forcing him to stumble, air knocked from his lungs. Dom saw the opening, capitalized instantly, grabbing Zion by the collar and hurling him against a metal crate, the impact exploding through his spine, leaving his vision flickering at the edges. For the first time in a long time, Zion felt the weight of a real fight. Dom grinned, licking blood from his split lip as he advanced again, swinging with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Zion waited. Let him get close. Let him commit to the next punch before he moved. A sharp pivot, a quick step inside the attack, a brutal elbow to the side of Dom's knee. The bigger man staggered, his balance momentarily thrown, and Zion capitalized, slamming a fist into his throat before hooking his leg behind Dom's and twisting him to the ground. Dom choked, gasping, struggling to rise, but Zion was already on him, wrapping an arm around his throat, squeezing, pressing down with the force of a predator putting down an injured beast. "You've got one chance," Zion whispered, tightening his hold just enough to make the panic set in. "Tell me where Novak's power starts, or you don't walk out of this room." Dom wheezed, his body twitching, his hands clawing at Zion's grip, his pride forcing him to hold on a few seconds longer than his body could endure before. Finally, he broke, he gasped, his voice ragged, filled with the kind of desperate realization that came too late. "Lena Vasquez. She's Novak's top lieutenant, his strategist. If you want him, you go through her." Zion exhaled slowly, then tightened his hold once more. Not enough to kill, but enough to remind Dom that this was the last time he would ever be the predator in the room. Then he let go. Dom crumpled, coughing, his body too broken to rise. Zion pushed to his feet, rolling his shoulders, already thinking about the next move. Because now he had a new target, and Lena Vasquez wouldn't go down easy. Zion sat in the driver's seat of the unmarked sedan, the soft rumble of the engine idling beneath his fingertips as he rested his hands on the wheel. The streets beyond the windshield were quiet, but he knew better than to believe in the illusion of peace. The city had never truly been still, not with men like Viktor Novak carving their control into every corner, leaving fear in their wake, like the scent of rain before a storm. He had taken down two of Novak's key men, first Miguel Rivas, then Dominic Varela, and in doing so, he had ripped open a wound in Novak's organization that wouldn't heal easily. He had expected retaliation, but instead of Novak coming at him directly, the next move had come in the form of a name, Lena Vasquez. Unlike the others, Lena wasn't just another enforcer. She was the mind behind the operations, the strategist, the one who saw the bigger picture when others only saw their next paycheck. If Novak had sent her into the fight, it meant Zion was closer than he had realized. It meant Novak was starting to feel him. He needed more than just instinct to track her down. That was why he was here, waiting. The passenger door opened without a word, and Detective Ethan Mercer slid into the seat beside him, tossing a manila folder onto Zion's lap before pulling a cigarette from his pocket. The sharp flick of the lighter cut through the silence, the orange glow illuminating Mercer's tired face as he inhaled deeply before exhaling a slow stream of smoke. "You know," Mercer muttered, rolling the cigarette between his fingers, "most people who go up against Novak don't make it past one of his lieutenants. You're making him nervous." Zion didn't take his eyes off the folder as he opened it, scanning the contents. Surveillance photos, reports, a pattern. "She's careful," Zion said, flipping through the pages, taking in Lena's movements, her habits, her known safe houses. "Careful." Mercer let out a dry chuckle. "She's a goddamn ghost. No phone records, no digital footprint, nothing. The only reason we know she exists is because bodies tend to drop wherever she's been." He flicked ash out the window. "She's different from Rivas and Varela. They were muscle. But Lena? She's precision." Zion nodded, absorbing the information. "She doesn't sit in one place for long," Mercer continued, tapping a finger on one of the reports. "Moves between different safe houses, always staying ahead. But one thing's been consistent. This place." He pulled a separate sheet from the folder and passed it to Zion. It was a warehouse, an old manufacturing plant on the east side of the city, one that had been abandoned for years but still saw activity in the dead of night. "She's been spotted there twice in the past month," Mercer said. "Could just be another one of Novak's stash spots, or it could be something more." Zion studied the photo. The warehouse was isolated, surrounded by crumbling buildings and empty lots. Perfect for business that didn't want an audience. "She's expecting me," Zion murmured. "Of course she is." Mercer took another drag from his cigarette. "Question is, are you walking in there knowing it's a setup? Or are you hoping you're wrong?" Zion closed the folder, tossing it onto the dashboard before shifting the car into gear. "I don't hope," he said simply. The city lights faded behind him as Zion drove east, the glow of neon and street lamps giving way to the dim, uneven flicker of industrial fixtures, the kind that buzzed softly like dying electricity. The streets here were emptier, quieter, but not in a way that meant safety. He kept his focus ahead, his mind sharp, the details of the reports still fresh in his head. Lena didn't move without a reason. If she had allowed herself to be seen at this warehouse, then it meant she had made a decision to be found. He adjusted the holster beneath his jacket, checking the weight of the pistol against his ribs. He didn't intend to rely on it. He preferred his hands, the certainty of them, the control they gave him in a fight. But Novak's people weren't above using guns, and he wasn't arrogant enough to think he was untouchable. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal frame skeletal against the night sky, the broken windows jagged like the teeth of something waiting to devour whatever stepped inside. Zion parked the car a block away, stepping out quietly, his breath slow, controlled, as he scanned his surroundings. The air smelled like rust and damp asphalt, the remnants of old industry lingering like a ghost. There were no visible guards outside, no movement, but that only confirmed what he already knew. They weren't outside because they were already inside, waiting. He approached with purpose, his footsteps silent against the cracked pavement, his senses tuned to every sound, every flicker of movement in the dark. The warehouse doors were slightly ajar, enough to let him in without effort. He stepped inside. The silence was immediate, thick and heavy, pressing in from all sides. Zion's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, the metal scaffolding above casting long shadows across the floor, crates stacked haphazardly against the walls. There was a faint glow coming from deeper inside. Firelight, its flickering edges licking at the dark. He moved further in, slow and deliberate, his body already shifting into readiness, his breathing steady, a creak from above, a whisper of movement to his left. Then, the click of a gun's safety being disengaged. "Welcome, soldier." Lena's voice broke the silence, smooth and sharp like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "Took you long enough." The moment the words left her lips, the trap sprang shut. The lights overhead burst to life, flooding the space in a harsh, artificial glow. Zion didn't flinch. 4 men stepped out from the shadows, guns raised, their stances disciplined. Not hired street thugs, trained killers, Novak's best. And standing on the catwalk above them, looking down at him with a smirk that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes, Lena Vasquez, Novak's deadliest weapon. "You came all this way for me," she mused, tapping her nails lightly against the metal railing. "I'm flattered." Zion didn't speak. He was already calculating, already measuring the angles, the exits, the distance between him and each threat. The fight hadn't started yet, but it would. And when it did, there would be no escape, only fire and blood. Zion Hawthorne stood in the middle of the warehouse, his posture loose but deliberate, his body already shifting into readiness as he took in every detail of the room. The harsh glow of overhead lights had burned away the shadows, leaving nowhere to hide. The metal scaffolding above creaked faintly, the weight of Lena Vasquez resting against the railing as she looked down at him with that same cool, unreadable expression, her fingers tapping lightly against the steel. The men flanking him were spread out just enough to cover different angles, their stances disciplined, controlled, the weight of their weapons balanced with the ease of professionals. These weren't common street soldiers. They were killers, trained and efficient. Novak's best. And Zion didn't wait for them to make the first move. The second he saw the twitch of a finger, the shift in muscle, the instinctive tightening of the jaw that always preceded a trigger pull, he moved. The first shot fired, missing by inches as Zion rolled to his left, slipping between 2 crates, using the terrain to his advantage. The echo of gunfire rattled through the space, deafening, the muzzle flashes brief bursts of light cutting through the warehouse. He didn't return fire, not yet. He let them react, let them chase him, let them believe he was simply dodging until they fell into the rhythm he wanted. The man closest to him had adjusted his stance, following Zion's movement with calculated patience, keeping his gun leveled, tracking like a hunter sighting prey. Zion made him commit, gave him just a second's worth of a clear shot, before twisting low, cutting sideways into a sprint. The attacker shifted his aim, but by the time he pulled the trigger, Zion was already in the air, closing the distance, his hands locking around the barrel. With a sharp, controlled twist, he turned the rifle up, forcing the man's own momentum against him, snapping his wrist out of alignment. The gun fired, the round burrowing into the ceiling instead of Zion's chest. A second later, Zion drove his forearm against the man's throat, smashing him backward against a stack of metal crates. The man choked on his own breath, fingers scrambling for his sidearm, but Zion didn't give him the chance. He twisted the rifle fully out of his grip, spun it in his hands, and used the butt of it to slam into the man's temple. The impact was brutal, the body collapsing against the steel floor. Zion didn't keep the rifle. He tossed it aside, already moving toward the next threat. 2 more gunmen had shifted into a new position, moving in tandem, one providing suppressive fire, while the other advanced toward Zion's last position. They were trained, tactical, disciplined, but predictable. He timed his movement with precision, letting the spray of bullets pass just behind him before lunging forward, twisting into the open space between the advancing gunman and the suppressing shooter. The man moving forward barely had time to react before Zion drove a knee into his ribs, cracking at least one, forcing a strangled noise of pain from his throat. The gun jerked in his hands, his grip faltering, his aim losing focus, just long enough for Zion to grab his wrist and wrench it sideways. A single gunshot exploded into the space, the bullet embedding itself into the suppressing shooter's shoulder. Before either of them could recover, Zion shifted his weight and snapped the gunman's elbow backward in a sharp, brutal motion. The scream barely left his lips before Zion tore the weapon from his hands and turned it against him, firing 2 controlled rounds into his chest. The other shooter, clutching his bleeding shoulder, still tried to raise his gun. Zion reacted faster. A swift step forward, closing the gap, slamming the barrel of the pistol under his chin. "You want to die for Novak?" Zion's voice was low, controlled, steady. The man's lips trembled, his fingers still curled around the grip of his weapon, but he hesitated, the weight of his choice settling too late. Zion exhaled. Then he pulled the trigger. The body hit the ground, and for the first time since the fight had started, silence pressed in between the burning air. Lena Vasquez was still perched above, watching, her expression unchanged, as if she had expected nothing less from him. Zion wiped the blood from his lip, adjusting his stance, breathing through the pain blooming in his ribs. He knew she wasn't going to run. Lena didn't operate that way. She had sent these men to slow him down, to gauge him, to measure the depth of the storm that had come for Novak. And now, with her forces reduced to bodies cooling on the floor, she knew exactly what she was dealing with. Zion exhaled once, slow and controlled, before finally breaking the silence. "Come down," he said, his voice carrying through the smoke and embers licking at the warehouse walls. "Unless you're just here to watch me kill your men." Lena smiled then, slow and sharp, pushing off the railing in one smooth motion. She landed without a sound, a predator stepping onto the battlefield. "You're good," she admitted, rolling her shoulders, stretching out the muscles in her arms like she was warming up. "Better than most. Maybe better than all of them." She nodded toward the bodies scattered around them. "But that's not going to be enough." Zion watched her carefully, measuring the space between them, reading the tension in her stance, the weight in her frame. Lena wasn't like the others. She didn't come at him with brute strength. She didn't try to overwhelm with numbers or firepower. She was a different kind of threat, and this fight was going to be nothing like the others. The heat pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. The flames that had once been a slow, creeping threat now consuming entire sections of the warehouse. The wooden beams above crackling, embers floating through the air like dying stars. The bodies of Lena's men lay sprawled across the concrete, silent and motionless, but she didn't look at them. Her focus was entirely on him. Zion stood opposite her, shoulders squared, the weight of exhaustion settling into his body. But his stance remained unshaken, his breathing controlled. He had fought through war zones, taken down men built like giants, survived combat that had left lesser warriors broken. But he knew Lena Vasquez was different. She didn't rely on brute force. She was a tactician, a ghost, a predator who didn't waste movement. Everything about her was calculated, measured, controlled, and Zion could see it in the way she studied him now. Those sharp, predatory eyes scanning for the smallest weakness, the slightest opening. "You're bleeding," she noted, tilting her head slightly, her voice calm despite the fire licking at the walls behind her. Zion glanced down briefly, saw the wound in his side where a bullet had grazed him earlier, the dark stain spreading through his shirt. He rolled his shoulders, flexing his fingers, the pain insignificant. "Not enough to matter," he replied. Lena smiled, slow and knowing, her posture loose, almost relaxed. But Zion wasn't fooled. She was coiled tension, waiting for the moment to strike. Then she moved. Zion barely had time to react before she was on him, her speed nearly impossible, her body shifting in a blur as she closed the distance between them with lethal efficiency. She wasn't like the others, the men who swung with raw power and brute force. Her attacks were sharp, precise, meant to dismantle rather than overwhelm. The first strike came from her right, a feint meant to test his reaction. Her real attack already in motion from the left, a blade flashing toward his ribs. Zion pivoted just in time, his instincts carrying him back a fraction of a second before the blade would have sliced through flesh. He caught the glint of steel in her grip. A karambit, the curved assassin's weapon designed for tearing, not stabbing. She wasn't just aiming to kill him, she was aiming to carve him apart. He countered fast, stepping in before she could reset, aiming a sharp elbow toward her throat, a quick, brutal strike meant to crush her windpipe. She slipped beneath it like water, spinning with the movement rather than against it, using the momentum to slash upward with the blade. Zion twisted, feeling the bite of steel against his arm, shallow but enough to remind him just how dangerous she was. He didn't stop, didn't hesitate, retaliating with a knee toward her ribs. But she anticipated it, shifting her weight, absorbing the blow as she hooked her leg behind his knee, attempting to take him off balance. Zion dropped his center of gravity at the last second, adjusting with the force rather than fighting it, slamming his forearm into the inside of her elbow, disrupting her control over the blade. She was fast, but he was stronger. For a second, neither of them moved, locked in a battle of leverage, both straining against the other in a contest of dominance. The fire roared behind them, the air thick with smoke, but neither backed down, their bodies tense with the knowledge that a single mistake, a fraction of a second lost, meant death. Then she changed the rhythm. Instead of pulling away, she stepped closer, her free hand striking fast and brutal against his jaw, the force of it sending sharp pain rattling through his skull. Zion absorbed it, his grip on her wrist tightening as he twisted sharply, finally wrenching the blade free from her grasp. But she didn't need it. The moment the knife was gone, she countered with a spinning kick toward his ribs, her flexibility turning the strike into something whip-like, the impact cracking through him with enough force to stagger him a step back. She pressed the advantage, coming in low, aiming a vicious strike toward his knee, the kind that could cripple a man permanently. Zion barely managed to block, catching her leg with his forearm, twisting his body to absorb the impact, before retaliating with a downward hammer fist toward her shoulder. She moved just enough to lessen the force, but he still felt the impact ripple through her frame. Still, she didn't stop. She adapted, rolling with the blow, using the movement to bring herself back up, her elbow cutting toward his temple, the sheer aggression of her attacks unrelenting. Zion caught it this time, trapping her arm mid-motion, using her momentum against her, forcing her forward, spinning her into a chokehold. For the first time in the fight, she hesitated, her muscles tensed beneath his grip, her body struggling against the pressure closing around her throat. She was fast, lethal, but Zion was a different kind of predator, one who knew how to break a body down completely. "You can't beat me," he murmured against her ear, voice calm, absolute. Lena's lips curled in defiance, even as she struggled for air. "We'll see." Then, without warning, she twisted violently, wrenching free from his grasp in a way no untrained fighter could have. Zion took a step back, adjusting, readying himself for the next assault. Lena exhaled, rolling her neck, her body swaying lightly, ready to move again. The fire continued to spread, the warehouse growing hotter, the metal beams above groaning as they weakened. The fire raged, the air thick with smoke, the flickering light casting long shadows against the collapsing walls of the warehouse. The structure groaned beneath its own destruction, metal beams twisting under the heat, and yet neither Zion nor Lena moved to escape. They were too deep into the fight, their bodies running on instinct, each breath a calculated effort, each movement carrying the weight of survival. Zion could feel the shift happening. Lena was slowing, her attacks less fluid, her breathing heavier. The bruises forming beneath her skin told the story of a battle that was no longer in her favor. Her confidence had not disappeared, but he could see it. The slight hesitation, the recognition that she was being outmatched, that Zion wasn't just another target, but a force she hadn't fully prepared for. He pressed forward, driving a sharp elbow into her ribs, following with a brutal knee to her midsection that sent her staggering back. She tried to reset her stance, tried to adjust, but Zion didn't give her the chance. He closed the distance, grabbing her by the throat, lifting her before slamming her hard against the cold concrete. Her body tensed beneath the impact, her fingers clawing weakly at his forearm as he pinned her down, his breath controlled despite the burning exhaustion settling into his muscles. "This is over," he said, his voice steady, absolute. Lena struggled, but Zion had her locked in place, his weight pressing down on her, his grip unrelenting. For the first time, he saw something flicker across her expression. Not fear, but something close to it. Then, the warehouse doors burst open. Zion barely had time to react before a rush of figures stormed inside. Weapons drawn, their movements sharp, efficient. These weren't hired muscle. These were men trained to kill. Novak's personal enforcers. Lena moved in the chaos. With a sudden burst of movement, she drove her knee into Zion's wounded ribs, white-hot pain exploding through his body, as his grip faltered just enough for her to slip free. She rolled, landing on her feet, blood dripping from her split lip, her breathing ragged, but her eyes sharp, calculating her next move even as the room filled with Novak's men. Gunfire erupted. Zion barely managed to dive for cover as bullets tore through the warehouse, ripping apart crates, shattering glass, sending embers scattering through the air. The structure, already weakened by fire, groaned in protest as the flames climbed higher. By the time he repositioned, Lena was already retreating into the shadows, her silhouette disappearing through the smoke as the reinforcements laid down cover fire. She had stalled him long enough for Novak's men to arrive. Now, she was gone. Zion didn't chase. He moved fast, weaving through the gunfire, taking down 2 enforcers in quick succession, snapping one's neck before wresting the rifle from the second and turning it against him. Shots rang out. Bodies hit the floor. But the moment Zion had control of the fight, the remaining men pulled back, vanishing into the night. They weren't here to kill him. They were here to slow him down. Then his phone vibrated. Zion exhaled sharply, pulling it from his pocket, his fingers still stained with blood as he glanced at the screen. A message, no name, but the words carved into his mind deeper than any wound he had taken tonight. "You wanted my attention. Now you have it. I also have your mother. Let's talk." The air around him stilled. He stared at the words, his breath slowing, his jaw clenching as the reality of what had just happened settled in. Novak had her. Regina Hawthorne, the one person in this world Zion would burn entire cities to protect, was now in the hands of the man he had been hunting. The fight had never been about power for Zion. It had never been about proving something, never about dominance or control. This had been a mission of precision, of taking apart Novak's empire piece by piece, dismantling him the way Zion had been trained to dismantle enemy forces. But Novak had changed the rules. This wasn't about tearing down an empire anymore. Zion exhaled, forcing himself to stay focused, despite the heat pressing in from all sides, despite the dull ache in his ribs, despite the blood dripping down his arm. The warehouse was collapsing, but he didn't move. His mind had already shifted into something colder, something deadlier. Novak thought this was checkmate. He was wrong. Then, from outside, the sound of sirens cut through the distance. But Zion didn't relax. He recognized the tone, the pattern of the approaching vehicles. Not just police, but the ones who didn't come unless they were given orders. Novak's orders. Zion barely had time to step back into the shadows before 2 blacked-out squad cars skidded to a stop just outside the burning warehouse. Figures emerged, their movements controlled, the weight of their presence more than just law enforcement. These weren't cops coming to investigate a crime. These were men who already knew what had happened, men who were here to clean up Novak's mess. Among them, a figure moved differently. Not rushed, not cautious, but confident, with the slow, deliberate arrogance of someone who believed the city belonged to him. Sergeant Clive. Zion had heard the name before. knew his reputation well enough. A man who had worn a badge long enough to know exactly how much of the law could be bent before it broke. A man who had spent his years working for the highest bidder, ensuring that men like Novak never had to answer for the blood they spilled. Clive pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it casually as he stared up at the warehouse, watching the flames eat through what was left of the structure. Zion stayed hidden, watching. One of the officers moved closer to Clive, his voice low. No sign of the target. Clive exhaled a slow drag, tapping ash onto the pavement. Doesn't matter. His gaze flicked toward the phone in his hand, scanning something. A message from Novak, most likely. He smirked. Boss got what he wanted. This was just the warning. Zion's grip tightened. It had never been about taking Novak apart piece by piece. It was about sending a message, and Novak had just sent his loudest one yet. Zion tucked the phone away, stepping back into the darkness, his mind already turning toward what came next. Novak had his mother. That meant there was only one outcome now. Zion was coming for him. The night stretched long and unforgiving as Zion navigated through the back streets of the city, his mind sharpening into something lethal, his body moving with purpose, the weight of the mission pressing down on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as fuel, a relentless force driving him forward. He had never needed anger to fight, had never allowed emotions to dictate his actions. But this was different. He had taken apart Novak's operation with precision, dismantling his network one lieutenant at a time, leaving nothing but chaos in his wake. But instead of retreating, instead of caving under the pressure of losing control, Novak had retaliated in the only way that guaranteed escalation. By taking Regina, Novak had ensured that there would be no negotiation, no measured strategy, no tactical retreat, only war. Zion had seen men like Novak before, had watched powerful criminals build themselves into untouchable kings, surrounding themselves with walls and guards, with influence that spread into places most people didn't even realize had been bought. But in every case, no matter how untouchable they believed themselves to be, there was always a weakness, always a blind spot, and he had every intention of finding Novak's and tearing it apart from the inside. He had spent hours gathering information, sifting through every possible lead, exhausting every resource he had left in the city, until finally there was only one call to make, one man who could give him exactly what he needed. Zion hadn't spoken to Malik Ortiz in years, hadn't needed to, because their paths had diverged long ago. But if there was one person who still had the ability to see beyond the surface, who could dig through the cracks and find the hidden fractures in Novak's empire, it was Malik. And right now, he needed every advantage he could get. The meeting was arranged without hesitation, a silent understanding passing between them through nothing but a few words over the phone, no unnecessary explanations, no wasted time, because Malik already knew what kind of war Zion was preparing for, and there was no need to spell it out. The old garage where they met had once been a safe house, a neutral ground where deals were made, information was traded, and alliances were solidified. But now it was little more than an abandoned shell, the remnants of its past lingering in the dust-covered workbenches and rusting tools. Scattered across the concrete floors, Zion stepped inside without hesitation, his presence acknowledged with nothing more than a slow nod from Malik, who sat hunched over a laptop, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the keys, pulling up files that had been buried under layers of security, meant to keep people like him out. "You always had a way of stirring up hell," Malik muttered, his eyes still fixed on the screen as he sifted through feeds, images, reports that painted a picture Zion had already seen in his head. But now, with confirmation, Novak's not just sitting on this. He's digging in. He's got the police running interference, he's reinforcing his safe houses, and he's making sure that if you come for him, you don't walk out alive. Zion didn't react, didn't shift, didn't let the weight of those words slow him down, because he had already accepted that the moment Novak had taken. Regina, this wasn't about survival anymore. Where is he keeping her? Malik sighed, dragging a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a flick of his lighter, taking a slow inhale before exhaling a thin stream of smoke, his fingers finally settling on a single image, one that flickered across the laptop screen, revealing a heavily fortified compound sitting just outside the city limits, surrounded by open terrain, no easy exits, no gaps in its security that hadn't already been accounted for. This is it. Private estate, 24-hour security, off-grid surveillance, multiple layers of protection, and the kind of manpower that makes a frontal assault suicide. Zion studied the screen, his gaze methodical, breaking down every inch of the structure, every possible entry point, knowing that no matter how secure it seemed, no matter how many men Novak had inside, there was always a way in. I need an entry point. Malik hesitated, tapping the screen again, pulling up another schematic, this time of the underground system running beneath the compound. Old tunnels that had once been used for smuggling, reinforced over the years but still functional. This is your best shot. Novak had these modified, but they're still there, still active. It's not a clean entry, but it'll get you inside without setting off every alarm in the city. Zion nodded, his mind already mapping out the approach, already breaking down the steps that needed to happen before he moved. He would need weapons, silencers, a way to disable their security before they realized he was inside. But more than that, he needed to move fast, because the longer Novak had Regina, the more unpredictable the situation became, and he wasn't willing to risk what that meant. Malik exhaled another slow breath, watching him carefully, the weight of experience clear in his expression. Because he had seen men walk into fights they couldn't win before, and he had seen what happened when they underestimated the kind of power they were up against. Look, I get it. This isn't something you walk away from, but you need to understand. Novak isn't going to just let you take her and leave. He's got cops, mercenaries, men who don't ask questions before pulling the trigger. And Clive's got the force so locked down that even if you do get out, they'll be waiting for you on the other side. Zion met his gaze, his expression unshaken, his resolve absolute. Then I won't give them the chance. Malik shook his head, exhaling another slow drag from his cigarette before pushing a USB drive across the table. Everything you need is on here. Blueprints, security rotations, personnel lists. Use it, because once you move, there's no turning back. Zion took the drive, sliding it into his pocket before stepping back toward the door, his mind already focused on what came next, on the weight of what he was walking into, on the reality that this wasn't just about taking Novak down anymore. This was about making sure that by the time the sun rose, there was nothing left of the empire he had built. Novak thought he had won, thought that by taking Regina, he had found Zion's weakness. But what he didn't understand, what he had never understood, was that Zion didn't have weaknesses. He had a mission, and Novak had just given him a reason to finish it. The storm above was restless, the night sky a canvas of dark clouds stretching across the horizon, the air thick with tension, mirroring the unease that settled over the fortified compound ahead. Zion crouched near the tunnel entrance, his breathing slow, controlled, his fingers flexing around the silenced pistol in his grip, his mind already working through the sequence of actions that would take him from here to his mother. The earpiece crackled. "You in position?" Malik's voice came through, steady but alert, his presence a reminder that Zion wasn't completely alone in this. Zion exhaled. "Moving now." "All right. Listen," Malik continued, the faint sound of his keyboard tapping in the background. "I've got eyes on their external security feeds. You've got about 40 seconds before the next camera rotation. That tunnel's gonna drop you right into one of their lower levels. But after that, you're on your own. No cameras inside, at least none I can access." Zion pulled at the rusted grate, the metal groaning under years of decay before it gave way, revealing the darkness beyond. That's all I need. He slipped inside, the scent of damp earth and stagnant air wrapping around him as he descended into the underground passage, the distant vibrations of the compound's operations humming above. He moved carefully, his steps soundless against the concrete, every breath measured as he neared the hatch leading to the basement level of the compound. 2 guards inside, Malik's voice came again, calm, methodical. One by the door, another by a supply crate. They're not expecting company. Zion reached the hatch, pressing against the cool metal, listening for the subtle shifts of movement. Then, with practiced precision, he moved, bursting through in a blur of motion, his knife flashing under the dim industrial lighting as he drove it into the throat of the first guard, silencing him before his weapon could be raised. The second man barely had time to react before Zion lunged forward, catching him by the wrist, twisting the gun out of his hand before slamming an elbow into his face, cartilage cracking beneath the impact. The man staggered, blood spilling from his broken nose, but Zion didn't let him recover. He grabbed the back of the man's head and slammed it into the crate behind him, the force of the impact leaving him unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence. "Damn," Malik muttered. "Remind me to never piss you off." Zion ignored the comment, already moving deeper into the compound, his body shifting between the shadows, his senses tuned to every sound, every shift in the air. He knew there were more men ahead, knew that once he engaged, the fight wouldn't stop until every last one of them was down. He reached the main corridor, pausing just long enough to let Malik guide him. "3 coming your way," Malik warned. "Looks like a patrol unit. You might want to—" Too late. The lead mercenary turned the corner, his rifle already rising, his eyes locking onto Zion just as the first shot was fired. Zion moved instantly, dropping low, twisting his body as the round barely missed him, embedding into the metal panel behind. He surged forward before the shooter could adjust, grabbing the barrel of the rifle and yanking it downward while his other hand struck out, a sharp, calculated strike to the throat. The man choked, his body convulsing as Zion spun him around, using him as a shield as the other 2 mercenaries opened fire. Bullets tore into their own man, ripping through him before Zion shoved the body aside and fired twice. 2 clean headshots, both targets down before their fingers could tighten around the trigger again. The hallway fell into silence, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. "You're clear," Malik said, though there was something in his tone, a hint of urgency. Zion reloaded, his movements efficient, controlled. "What is it?" "I just tapped into Novak's comms. They know you're inside." Zion's grip tightened. "How much time do I have?" "Not much. He's sending in his elite team, the ones who don't miss. And, Malik hesitated. Zion's voice remained steady. "Say it." "Clive's men are on their way too. Looks like Novak pulled in every favor he had." Zion exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, already pushing forward, knowing that turning back wasn't an option. He had expected this. He had known Novak wouldn't just sit and wait for him to carve his way through the compound without answering in kind. He moved quickly, clearing another 2 rooms, taking down more guards with swift, brutal efficiency. His body moving on instinct, his mind operating like a machine fine-tuned for destruction. The deeper he went, the more resistance he encountered, until finally he reached the grand staircase leading toward the upper floors, toward where Regina was being held. But as he took his first step forward, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of reinforced boots marching in formation, the synchronized movement of men trained to kill. Then, the first flashbang detonated. The world exploded in light and sound, a disorienting burst that sent shock waves through his skull, his vision fracturing, his ears ringing with the sheer force of the blast. He barely had time to recover before the first strike came, a heavy boot slamming into his chest, sending him crashing backward into the concrete wall. Pain surged through his ribs, but he rolled with it, forcing himself to move before the next attack landed. His body ached, but his mind remained sharp, his instincts guiding him as he ducked low, just in time to avoid the blade that sliced through the air where his throat had been seconds before. He retaliated fast, grabbing the attacker's wrist, twisting hard enough to snap tendons, forcing the knife free before driving it into the man's side. A second mercenary was already on him, swinging the butt of his rifle toward Zion's skull, but Zion caught the barrel mid-motion, shoving it aside before driving a brutal elbow into the man's face, breaking bone with a sickening crunch. A third figure appeared, bigger, armored, methodical in his approach, moving with the patience of a predator. Zion barely dodged the first strike before the man drove him back again, his sheer strength forcing Zion to adjust his approach, to shift tactics. And then, through the ringing in his ears, Malik's voice crackled in his earpiece. "You still alive?" Zion exhaled sharply, wiping blood from his mouth. "Working on it." "Well, work faster. Clive's guys are 6 minutes out. You don't have time to play around." Zion looked up at the remaining mercenaries, his body aching but his resolve unshaken. "I'm not playing." Then he launched himself back into the fight, knowing that the only way out was through. Zion's breath came slow and steady as he squared his stance, rolling his shoulders, blood dripping from a cut above his eyebrow, his ribs aching from the force of the last hit. But he didn't falter. The mercenaries in front of him weren't like the others. These men were trained, experienced, methodical. Not just soldiers, but executioners. Men who had been sent to make sure he didn't leave this compound alive. And Zion had no intention of dying here. The leader of the group, a towering figure clad in tactical armor, tilted his head slightly, gripping the heavy-duty combat knife in his gloved hand. "I've heard about you," he said, his voice low, almost conversational beneath the weight of the situation. "You're supposed to be some kind of ghost. Untouchable." His grip on the knife tightened. "Let's see how real you are." The others shifted subtly, spreading out, moving with practiced precision, cutting off Zion's exits, pressing him into the center of their formation. The fight erupted in an instant. Zion dodged the first blade, twisting just as one of the mercenaries lunged, the steel slicing through the air an inch from his throat. He countered fast, grabbing the attacker's wrist, twisting it violently until the bones cracked beneath his grip, the scream barely leaving the man's lips before Zion wrenched the knife free and drove it into his chest. No hesitation, no wasted movement. The second man came in harder, swinging the butt of his rifle toward Zion's ribs. But Zion moved with the attack, absorbing just enough of the impact to keep his balance before delivering a brutal palm strike to the man's throat, crushing his windpipe in a single, calculated blow. The others didn't falter. They adapted, shifting their strategy, forcing him into a more confined space, limiting his mobility, making sure he couldn't maneuver as freely. One of them lashed out with a baton electrified with high-voltage current, trying to catch Zion's shoulder. But Zion anticipated the move, catching the attacker's wrist mid-strike before twisting sharply, flipping the mercenary over his own body, slamming him down with bone-crunching force. Another lunged. Zion sidestepped. A knife glinted in the low light, but Zion caught the attacker's arm mid-motion, redirecting the stab before slamming the edge of his palm into the man's exposed neck. A strangled gasp. A collapse. Zion pivoted, but the leader was already moving, faster than the others, his movements fluid, precise, a level above the rest. He feinted left, then right, forcing Zion off balance before delivering a powerful kick to Zion's ribs, sending him skidding backward. Pain exploded through Zion's side, but he absorbed it, grounding himself before the next attack came. "You're tough," the leader admitted, circling him now, testing him. "But I've killed better men." Zion wiped the blood from his mouth, his stance unshaken. "Not today." The leader smirked, then charged. Their blades clashed in a rapid exchange, steel slicing through the air as they moved, each strike measured, each block precise. The mercenary was skilled, his technique refined, his footwork aggressive yet controlled. Zion recognized the pattern, the way the man fought. Military training, special operations, someone who had lived through more battles than most. But Zion was faster. When the next strike came, Zion twisted with it, moving in close, grabbing the man's wrist. And in a single swift motion, he snapped the leader's arm at the elbow, the joint bending in a direction it was never meant to. The scream barely left his lips before Zion drove his knee into the man's chest, then followed with a vicious elbow to his temple, knocking him unconscious before he hit the floor. Silence. Bodies surrounded him, motionless. His breathing was measured, his muscles burning, but he didn't stop. He didn't have time to stop. The earpiece crackled. "Zion!" Malik's voice was sharp, urgent. "You need to move now. More of Novak's men are on their way, and Clive's team just breached the outer perimeter." Zion exhaled, already moving toward the nearest staircase, his mind cutting through the exhaustion, focusing only on one thing. Regina! He sprinted up the stairs, his boots pounding against the steel, his grip tightening around his weapon as he moved through the second level. The halls were eerily quiet now, the previous gunfire leaving behind nothing but the distant echoes of chaos. He followed the mental blueprint Malik had given him, each turn bringing him closer, his heart pounding with a mix of focus and urgency. Then, a voice. "Help!" Regina. Zion's pulse spiked as he turned the final corner, reaching a set of reinforced doors at the end of the corridor. 2 guards stood in front, their attention snapping toward him the moment they registered his presence. They barely had time to react before Zion was on them. He fired once, a clean headshot, taking down the first. The second guard raised his weapon, but Zion was already there, knocking the gun aside before slamming him against the wall, his forearm crushing the man's throat. "Where is she?" Zion's voice was low, lethal. The guard choked, his hands clawing at Zion's grip, his eyes wide with fear. Zion pressed harder. "Where?" "Inside," the man wheezed. "She's inside." Zion didn't waste another second. He snapped the guard's neck, his body dropping lifelessly to the floor before Zion turned to the door, bracing himself. He kicked the door open. Inside, Regina sat tied to a chair, bruises on her arms, her eyes widening in relief the moment she saw him. Zion! He was at her side in an instant, cutting through the restraints, his hands gentle but urgent as he worked to free her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something raw. Regina shook her head, blinking through exhaustion. "I knew you'd come." Zion nodded once, helping her stand, his body instinctively shifting to shield her. "We're getting out of here!" Before she could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from down the hall. Zion turned, gripping his weapon. They weren't done yet. Zion kept his grip firm on Regina's arm as he scanned the room for additional threats, his mind already shifting gears, calculating their next move. The compound was compromised. The alarms hadn't sounded yet, but that was only a matter of time. The moment the next patrol found the bodies he had left behind, the entire place would erupt into chaos, and he wasn't planning on being here when that happened. Regina, despite the bruises on her arms and the exhaustion in her eyes, straightened her back, refusing to let the situation break her. "You came all this way just to drag me out of this mess?" she asked, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. Zion didn't hesitate, his tone absolute. "You're the only reason I came." She gave a small nod, her expression unreadable but strong. She had always been strong. He pressed a hand to his earpiece. "Malik, we're moving. What's my best exit?" The line crackled before Malik's voice cut through, tense but steady. "You've got 2 options. Main exit is a no-go. Novak's security is already shifting in that direction. Clive's men are about to breach the perimeter. You try walking out that way, you're walking straight into the lion's den." Zion clenched his jaw. "Second option? There's an underground tunnel that leads out of the compound, same way you came in. But," Malik hesitated, "it's going to be crawling with reinforcements in about 5 minutes. You need to move. Now." Zion glanced at Regina. His decision made in an instant. We take the tunnel. She didn't argue, just gave a curt nod. Then let's go. But Zion wasn't done yet. He pulled out a small black case from his tactical vest, flipping it open to reveal a set of high-yield explosives rigged with remote timers. Regina's gaze flickered to the devices before settling back on him. I don't even want to know where you got those. Zion gave her a grim look. It's not where I got them that matters. It's what I'm about to do with them, she exhaled. And here I thought we were just walking out of here. He smirked slightly. Despite everything, I don't leave loose ends. Moving quickly, he planted the first charge beneath a steel support beam, setting the timer for 7 minutes. Just enough time for them to get clear before the structure collapsed on itself. He placed another by the weapons cache in the far corner, ensuring that Novak's stockpile wouldn't survive the night. He handed a small detonator to Regina. If things go sideways, press this. No hesitation. She took it without question, gripping it firmly. If things go sideways, you better be running fast. They moved quickly, navigating through the compound's dim corridors, Zion leading the way, his pistol raised, every step measured, every corner checked before advancing. The silence around them felt unnatural, like the calm before a violent storm. And then, the alarms blared. The echoing wail of the security system burst through the compound, red emergency lights flashing along the walls. Malik's voice came through the earpiece, urgency lacing his words. They found the bodies. You've got company. Lots of it. Zion swore under his breath. How much time? You don't want the answer. They didn't stop moving. They turned a corner and walked straight into 2 guards. The first barely had time to react before Zion fired twice, dropping him with clean headshots. The second raised his rifle, but Regina was already moving, grabbing a loose metal pipe from the ground and swinging it hard into the man's knee. He howled in pain, stumbling, and Zion finished it with a shot to the head. Regina wiped her hands on her clothes, breathing heavily. You're not the only one who can fight, you know. Zion gave her a brief glance, his respect for her never wavering. Noted. They moved faster now, cutting through the compound's infrastructure, the flashing emergency lights illuminating their path. Malik's voice came through again. Zion, bad news. Clive's team just got clearance to enter. They're inside the compound. Zion gritted his teeth. We're almost at the tunnel. Then, a group of armed men stormed into the hallway ahead of them. Zion shoved Regina behind him as he dropped into a low stance, firing off 3 quick shots, taking down 2 of them immediately. The third opened fire, forcing Zion to roll into cover, dragging Regina with him behind a thick steel column as bullets shredded through the air. Zion, Malik's voice came through again. I just lost my feed on the tunnel's exit. That means someone's down there waiting for you. Zion breathed heavily, assessing their position. How many? More than you want. Regina gripped his arm. We're not stopping now. Zion reloaded, his movements fluid, precise. We keep moving. They advanced, using the chaos to their advantage, weaving through the gunfire, Zion taking down enemies with precise, calculated shots, while Regina stayed close, moving when he moved, covering when she needed to. By the time they reached the tunnel entrance, Zion could already hear the footsteps echoing from the other end, the unmistakable sound of boots marching in formation. They're waiting, Regina whispered. Zion exhaled, his mind already running through the next steps. Then we don't give them time to plan. He reached for the detonator. With a sharp press, the charges he had set detonated in perfect sequence. The first explosion rocking the entire compound, the second igniting the weapons cache, sending a chain reaction of fire and destruction through the structure. Screams echoed from above, the ground beneath them trembling. Zion grabbed Regina's hand. Run! They sprinted into the tunnel, the sound of destruction roaring behind them. Gunfire erupted from ahead, but Zion didn't slow, dodging and weaving as he fired, taking down the first wave of enemies as they barreled forward, refusing to stop. The tunnel shook violently as another explosion went off, debris falling from the ceiling, dust and smoke filling the passage, the chaos consuming everything behind them. But they kept running. They had to, and by the time they saw the light at the tunnel's end, Zion knew. Novak's empire was burning, But the fight wasn't over yet. The night was thick with tension as Zion navigated through the ruined remnants of Novak's empire, his mind laser-focused on the final target. The compound was gone. His mother was safe. But this wasn't over, not yet. He needed one last piece of information, one last lead before he could finish this. Novak was still alive, and Zion had to find him. The police scanners were silent, but not because the city was at peace. It was because the corruption that ran through its veins had been momentarily stunned, struggling to understand what had just happened. Clive's men were scattered, either dead or pulling out of Novak's sinking ship. But there was one person Zion knew would still be watching the board, still waiting to see where the pieces fell. Detective Ethan Mercer. The meeting was arranged in an instant, a coded message sent through secure channels. No words needed beyond the location. Mercer was smart, one of the few who had survived in this city by knowing when to play the right cards. And right now, Zion was counting on that instinct to push him toward the final answer. The abandoned parking lot was quiet, empty except for Mercer's old sedan, its headlights dim, the engine running just enough to keep the heat flowing inside. Zion approached without hesitation, his stance loose but ready, his gun resting against his thigh, just in case. Mercer watched him from behind the wheel, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling in the cold air as Zion opened the passenger door and slid in. "You know," Mercer muttered, "I figured if you were still alive, you'd be on your way to finish this." He took another drag from his cigarette, his tired eyes flicking toward Zion. "I assume you need me to tell you where the fool ran off to?" Zion leaned back, his expression unreadable. "If you know, say it." Mercer let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, well, let's just say Novak's not exactly subtle when he's desperate. He's holed up at North Tower, top floor. He's got what's left of his personal security with him. But let's be real, he's not expecting to win this. He's just trying to hold on to whatever time he's got left." Zion absorbed the information, his mind already piecing together the approach, the entry points, the possible countermeasures Novak would have in place. Mercer studied him, his cigarette burning low between his fingers. "You know, I'm not gonna stop you. Nobody in this city is. But once you do this, there's no coming back. The cops, the feds, they'll let you clean this up, but after tonight, you disappear. No more names, no more traces." Zion nodded once. "I was never planning on staying." Mercer exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Didn't think so." He reached into his coat, pulling out a small burner phone, setting it on the dashboard. "That's for after, one number inside. If you ever need to get off the grid, call it." Zion glanced at the phone, but didn't touch it. "Appreciate it." Mercer let out another dry chuckle. "Yeah, well, I ain't doing it for you. I just like to know the city's got one less bastard to worry about." Zion opened the car door, stepping back into the cold air. Mercer called after him. "Hey!" Zion paused, glancing back. Mercer took another slow drag of his cigarette. "Make it count." Zion didn't answer. He was already gone. The North Tower loomed ahead, its sleek glass reflecting the city lights, standing tall like a monument to greed and power. A throne that Novak had sat on for too long. But tonight, Zion was going to rip him off of it. He moved with precision, slipping through the alleyways until he reached the service shaft Malik had pinpointed earlier. No alarms, no signs of increased security. It was too quiet, too controlled, as if Novak wasn't even bothering to hide. Malik's voice crackled through the earpiece. "All right, man, I've got eyes on the tower's security feeds. Looks like Novak's personal guards are stationed inside, but not outside. He's not expecting a siege. He thinks if you come for him, it'll be through the front doors." Zion adjusted his gear. "He's wrong." Malik chuckled. "That's what I like to hear. You're looking at 6 armed men between you and the penthouse. 2 in the upper balcony, 3 near the bar area, 1 roaming near the stairwell. Zion nodded, moving toward the maintenance shaft. What about Novak? Malik exhaled. He's waiting. Penthouse lounge. He's alone. Zion climbed the side of the building, his movements smooth and practiced, his grip firm as he scaled the structure, slipping into the shaft without hesitation. The service tunnels were forgotten spaces, remnants of an older design, pathways that existed outside of the main security grid. He navigated through them swiftly, following the mapped-out entry points Malik had provided. Then, he reached the executive level. The reinforced security door was the only thing standing between him and Novak's last line of defense. Zion pressed himself against the steel, his fingers brushing over the grip of his pistol as he slowed his breathing. "You ready?" Malik asked, his voice laced with anticipation. Zion rolled his shoulders, flexing his fingers. "Always!" He raised his gun and fired 3 precise rounds into the keypad, frying the circuits, sparks bursting from the panel. A second later, the lock failed with a low mechanical hiss. Zion kicked the door open. Gunfire erupted instantly. He barely had time to shift before bullets tore through the air, punching into the walls behind him, Novak's men responding with the precision of trained killers. The penthouse was expansive, cold, filled with towering windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, giving a perfect view of the city below. Zion didn't hesitate. He dove into cover, rolling behind a stone pillar as more rounds shredded through the space where he had just been standing. He inhaled deeply, listening, counting the enemies, pinpointing their positions. 6 men, 3 near the bar, 1 on the balcony, 2 moving to flank him. Zion exhaled. Then, he moved. He stepped out from behind the pillar and fired, his shots precise, calculated, tearing through the first target before twisting to take down the next. Bodies dropped, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. This was it, the last battle, and Novak was waiting. Zion moved like a phantom through the chaos, his body a blur of precision as he navigated the penthouse floor, the echoes of gunfire bouncing against the glass walls, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. Novak's guards were trained, but they were out of their depth. They weren't fighting a street-level enforcer or a rival gang hitman. They were fighting a ghost, a man who had spent his life perfecting the art of destruction. He pivoted behind a marble pillar, his mind already working 3 steps ahead, mapping the battlefield, tracking movement. 2 gunmen near the bar, one reloading, the other repositioning. The balcony guard was shifting for a better angle, lining up a clean shot from above. The 2 flanking mercenaries were closing in. They thought they had him pinned. They were wrong. Zion reached into his vest, pulling out a compact smoke grenade, his thumb flicking the pin free. In one smooth motion, he rolled it across the polished floor, the small metal cylinder bouncing once before erupting into a thick, suffocating cloud of white fog. The effect was immediate. The room was swallowed in smoke, visibility dropping to near zero. The gunmen hesitated, their tactics thrown into disarray, their formation breaking apart as they struggled to adjust. Zion didn't wait. He surged forward. The first target stumbled through the smoke, disoriented, his rifle swinging in the wrong direction. Zion was already there, his blade flashing in the haze, slicing clean across the man's throat before he could utter a sound. The second barely had time to register his fallen ally before Zion dropped low, sweeping his leg out in a precise arc, knocking the man off balance. Before he could recover, Zion drove his knife into his chest, twisting sharply before yanking it free. 2 down. The balcony guard had started firing blindly, his bullets tearing through the smoke in desperate arcs. Zion pressed himself against the bar, listening, timing the movement. The moment the firing pattern broke, he moved. With a single calculated shot, Zion sent a bullet through the man's knee. The sniper howled in agony, dropping his weapon, clutching at his leg as he collapsed onto the railing. Another shot followed, this time through the skull. The body slumped, the fight draining from him before he hit the floor. The final two mercenaries hesitated now, their confidence shaken, their carefully laid ambush crumbling in real time. Zion heard the faint shuffle of boots behind him, one of them trying to move in for a stealth kill. He let them get close. Then he struck. He pivoted, catching the gunman's wrist mid-swing before twisting sharply, dislocating the joint in a single, brutal motion. The man screamed, his weapon clattering to the floor, and Zion silenced him with a sharp elbow to the jaw, followed by a precise gunshot to the head. The last mercenary dropped his rifle, his hands trembling as he realized he was the only one left standing. Zion tilted his head slightly, his pistol steady, his voice calm. "Run!" The man didn't hesitate. He bolted, disappearing into the smoke, choosing survival over loyalty. The penthouse was silent now, except for Novak. Across the room, Novak stood near the entrance to his private office, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching slightly as he stared at the bodies surrounding him. He had expected a fight, but he had never expected this. Zion wasn't supposed to make it this far. The walls of the penthouse suddenly felt too thin, the massive windows exposing too much. The luxury that had once felt like untouchable power now reduced to nothing more than a cage. He was alone. His men, his hand-picked enforcers, the ones who were supposed to be able to handle any threat, were dead. Zion emerged from the smoke, his silhouette solidifying like a shadow stepping from the underworld, his gun still steady, his presence unshaken. Novak swallowed, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've been busy." Zion took another step forward. "You're out of time." Novak exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You think this changes anything?" He gestured around them. "You've killed my men, you've burned my empire, but you haven't won. Men like me don't just disappear." Zion didn't respond. Novak's fingers twitched near his waist. Zion caught the movement instantly, but before he could react, Novak made his move. He twisted sharply, slamming his hand onto a hidden panel along the bookshelf. A deep mechanical click echoed through the penthouse, followed by the slow, heavy groan of reinforced steel shifting into place. The panic room. Novak was retreating. Zion lunged forward, his boots hitting the floor in rapid strides, closing the distance in seconds, but it wasn't fast enough. The steel door slid shut just as he reached it, sealing Novak inside. Zion stopped short, his gun raised, his breath steady. He stared at the reinforced barrier, his mind already working through the next step. Novak's voice crackled through the hidden speakers embedded in the walls. Smug, and infuriating. "Well," Novak said, his tone regaining some of its former arrogance, "that was exciting." Zion didn't react, didn't rise to the bait. Novak exhaled a slow breath. "I'm impressed, really. You made it further than anyone else ever has. But this," he let out a chuckle, low and mocking. "This is where it ends." Zion placed a hand against the steel, his fingers running along the cool metal. Novak continued, "That door is military grade, sealed, reinforced, and entirely self-sufficient. You could plant a bomb, but the entire tower would come down before you made a dent in it." Zion took a step back, exhaling slowly. Novak chuckled again. "You lost, soldier." Zion pressed a finger to his earpiece. Malik's voice came through immediately. "I'm already on it." Zion nodded to himself, rolling his shoulders. The fight wasn't over yet. He glanced around the penthouse, scanning for weak points, knowing there was always another way in. Novak had put himself in a cage. Now, Zion just had to break it open. Zion stood in the ruined penthouse, his breath steady, his body still coiled with the tension of battle as he stared at the reinforced steel of Novak's panic room door. The crime lord had retreated, locked himself away in his last sanctuary. But Zion didn't look frustrated. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a man who had already decided how this was going to end. Novak's voice crackled through the hidden intercom, that same smug arrogance bleeding through despite the panic underneath. "You can't get in, Hawthorne. You don't have the time, the tools, or the firepower. You can kill my men, burn my empire, but you can't touch me." Zion ignored him, pressing a finger to his earpiece. Malik. Malik's voice came through immediately. Working on it. That door's got a biometric lock with an independent power source. That means no hacking. He exhaled sharply. You're gonna have to do this the hard way. Zion rolled his shoulders, adjusting his grip on his weapon. Good. He moved quickly, scanning the walls, running his hand along the seams of the reinforced steel, his mind dissecting its structure. No lock was unbreakable. No room was truly secure. Novak had built his empire believing that control meant safety, that walls and wealth could protect him. He was wrong. Zion found the weak point, a manual release panel built into the wall, hidden beneath the sleek architecture. It was meant for emergencies, a failsafe only Novak and his most trusted men knew about. Zion grabbed one of the fallen guards, dragging the lifeless body over, pressing the man's bloodied palm against the biometric scanner. The system hesitated. Then, a sharp hiss. The door unlocked. Zion moved instantly, kicking it open before Novak could react. Inside, the panic room was pristine, cold, a sterile contrast to the destruction outside. Novak stood near the center, a gun in his hand, his face pale, his arrogance crumbling as Zion stepped inside. You! Novak started, but Zion was already moving. The fight was brutal, immediate. Novak fired the first shot, but Zion was faster, twisting to the side, the bullet ripping through the air just inches from his ribs. He lunged, closing the distance before Novak could fire again, his hand locking around the gun, twisting it violently, forcing the weapon free. Novak stumbled back, but Zion didn't let up. He struck hard, an elbow slamming into Novak's jaw, sending him reeling. The crime lord grunted, recovering fast, swinging back with a wild punch. But Zion caught his wrist, redirected the force, driving a sharp knee into Novak's ribs. The air left Novak's lungs in a choked gasp, but he refused to go down, his survival instincts kicking in, his body moving with desperation. He lashed out, using his full weight to tackle Zion backward, slamming them both into the steel wall. Pain rippled through Zion's spine, but he absorbed it, shifting his weight, using Novak's own momentum against him. He spun sharply, reversing their positions, slamming Novak against the cold metal. Novak's fists came up in a frantic attempt to fight back, his knuckles splitting as they connected with Zion's forearm. Zion countered with a brutal right hook to Novak's ribs, then another, each one landing with bone-crunching force. Novak staggered, blood dripping from his mouth, his breathing ragged. But Zion wasn't done. He grabbed Novak by the collar, driving him forward, slamming him onto the panic room's steel table. The impact rattled the entire room, Novak coughing, his body shaking from the sheer force of the assault. Zion stepped back, giving Novak just enough space to push himself up onto his knees, his body trembling, his face contorted in pain. The gun. Zion reached down, picking up the weapon Novak had dropped, the same gun he had planned to use to save himself. The moment Novak saw it, his entire demeanor changed. The fight drained from him instantly, the bravado replaced with something raw, something desperate. No, Novak rasped, shaking his head. Wait, we can make a deal. Zion said nothing. Novak swallowed hard, his hands raising slowly in surrender. You don't have to do this, he whispered. You kill me, and nothing changes. I'm just one man. There will always be another. Zion stepped closer, pressing the barrel of the gun against Novak's forehead. Novak flinched, his breath hitching. Please. Zion exhaled. You were right. Novak's eyes darted up. What? Zion's voice was cold. Final. Men like you don't just disappear. That's why I'm here to make sure you do. Then, he pulled the trigger. A single shot rang out, echoing through the penthouse. Novak's body slumped instantly, collapsing onto the steel floor, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. It was over. The empire he had built, the fear he had ruled with, the power he had believed was untouchable, all of it ended in one final moment. Zion didn't move for a long second, just breathing, just standing in the silence of the aftermath. Then, Sirens. The sound of pounding footsteps filled the air, the penthouse flooding with armed officers, their weapons raised, their voices shouting commands as they stormed the space. Zion stayed still, his body loose but ready, his hands still steady. They had come too late. Detective Mercer pushed through the line of officers, his gaze sweeping across the room before finally landing on Zion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mercer sighed. "Well, guess that's that." Zion didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because this war was over, and he was still standing. Mercer found him sitting on the hood of a parked car outside the precinct, watching as officers moved in and out of the building, their faces marked with exhaustion, relief, and, for some, unease at the changes taking place. The city was still adjusting, still shifting under the weight of a power vacuum that had yet to settle, still learning what it meant to breathe without Novak's influence pressing down on its throat. Zion sat with his arms resting on his knees, his expression unreadable, his body still. But Mercer knew better than to mistake stillness for inaction. He wasn't the type to sit and watch without purpose. If he was still here, it meant he had already decided his next steps. Mercer stopped a few feet away, taking a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling through his nose as he studied him. "You're still here," he said, his voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than surprise. Zion didn't look at him, didn't shift his position, just kept his gaze on the street in front of him. "Never said I was leaving." Mercer scoffed, shaking his head slightly as he flicked the cigarette between his fingers. "Could have fooled me. Figured you'd be halfway across the country by now." Zion exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of amusement touching his expression. "Not my style." Mercer watched him carefully, taking another slow drag, letting the silence stretch between them for a moment before tilting his head toward the station. "So what now?" Zion finally shifted, straightening slightly, his eyes still locked on the city beyond them. "There's still work to do." Mercer let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it, just a knowing acceptance of the truth that neither of them wanted to fully acknowledge. "Yeah," he muttered, running a hand over his jaw before sighing. "There is." They sat there in silence, watching as the streets moved with a strange kind of energy, neither chaotic nor settled, the people moving with cautious optimism, unsure of what came next, but knowing, deep down, that the city had changed. The scars Novak had left behind wouldn't fade overnight, and neither of them were naive enough to believe that his death meant an end to everything he had built. There were still remnants of his empire lurking beneath the surface, still men who had profited from his reign who would be looking for ways to reclaim their power, still corrupt officials who hadn't yet been exposed. And Mercer knew Zion wasn't the type to walk away while those loose ends remained. After a long moment, Mercer spoke again, his voice quieter now, more measured. "You know, if you stick around, people are going to start asking questions." Zion smirked slightly, tilting his head just enough to meet his gaze. "Let them," Mercer huffed, shaking his head, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth despite himself. "You're a real pain in the ass. You know that?" Zion's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried the weight of unspoken understanding. "Yeah." Mercer took a final drag from his cigarette before tossing it into the street, crushing the ember beneath his boot as he exhaled. He could feel the shift happening, the weight of responsibility settling heavier on his shoulders now that Novak was gone, and the real work had begun. He had spent years maneuvering through a system that had been built to keep men like him from making a difference, and now that he finally had the chance to tear it apart from the inside, he wasn't about to waste it. The department was being gutted, the corruption bleeding out with every arrest, every indictment, every forced resignation that followed in the wake of Novak's downfall. Clive had been the first domino to fall, but he wouldn't be the last. Mercer had no plans to stop until every man who had sold their loyalty to Novak was held accountable. There were names, records, files that had been buried for years, evidence that had been ignored, and now that the floodgates had been opened, there was no going back. Regina wasn't going back either. She had seen the worst of what this city had to offer and had refused to let it break her, had refused to be just another victim in a system designed to overlook people like her. She had stood her ground when she had been attacked, had faced her captors without fear, and now, standing in front of a room full of people who had been waiting for change, waiting for someone to lead, she knew there was no turning away from this fight. She had walked into that police station and told them everything, had looked Mercer in the eye, and made sure he understood that she wasn't just here to give a statement. She was here to make sure that what happened to her, what had happened to so many others, would not happen again. She had spent her life teaching people to think, to question, to fight for themselves, and now she was putting that same conviction into the city that had tried to beat it out of her. And people were listening. The community was tired of waiting for heroes that never came. They were ready to take the fight into their own hands, to demand more, to rebuild what had been lost. Regina wasn't doing this alone, and she never had been. She wasn't the leader they had been waiting for. She was simply the one who had refused to back down. Mercer saw it. Zion saw it. The city saw it. This wasn't just the end of Novak's reign. It was the beginning of something new, and Zion wasn't walking away from it. The early morning air carried a quiet stillness, the city just beginning to stir. The sky painted in soft hues of gold and pale blue, the remnants of night fading as the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon. It wasn't the kind of morning Zion was used to. No tension, no lingering threat waiting just beyond the edge of his senses, no war still raging in the shadows. For the first time in years, there was nothing but silence. He stood at the sidewalk, staring up at the small house that had been the one constant in his life, the place that had remained standing through every storm, every hardship, every battle that had threatened to take everything away. The porch light, still on from the night before, flickered slightly against the wood, a familiar glow, a quiet reminder that some things never changed. Regina was already awake, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee cradled between her hands, her posture relaxed, her gaze calm, as she watched the morning unfold around her. She hadn't slept much, but not because of fear, not because of worry. She had simply been waiting. Zion climbed the steps, lowering himself onto the step beside her, his arms resting over his knees, his body finally beginning to feel the weight of everything that had come before this moment. They sat in silence, the quiet hum of the city waking up filling the air, the sound of distant traffic rolling through the streets, the occasional murmur of neighbors beginning their day. Regina took a slow sip of her coffee before speaking, her voice steady, matter of fact. "You stay in this time?" Zion exhaled, staring ahead at the empty road in front of them, his thoughts settling into something less restless than they had been the night before. He had spent so much of his life moving forward, always looking toward the next fight, the next mission, never allowing himself to stop long enough to ask if there was anything else beyond it. Now, sitting here, the war behind him, he wasn't sure if he knew how to do anything else. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than he expected. Regina hummed softly, as if she had already known that would be his answer. "You always had one foot out the door," she murmured, swirling her coffee slightly before taking another sip. "Even when you were a boy, I could see it. That restlessness, that need to keep moving." Zion glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. "That obvious?" She gave him a knowing look, a small smirk tugging at the edges of her lips. "Boy, please." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, a quiet chuckle escaping him. For a moment, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. Regina set her cup down beside her, folding her hands in her lap, her fingers lacing together as she studied him. "You don't have to stop," she said after a moment, her voice gentle but firm. "You just have to decide what you're fighting for." Zion swallowed, his gaze dropping slightly, his fingers brushing absent patterns against his palms. That had always been the problem, hadn't it? He had spent his life fighting other people's wars, completing missions assigned to him, eliminating threats defined by someone else. But this This had been his, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what came next. Regina reached over, placing a hand over his, squeezing gently. "You did good, baby," she murmured, her voice carrying that quiet warmth that had always been there, even when he hadn't realized how much he needed it. "You did what no one else could. But this city ain't your responsibility anymore." Zion nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure if he fully believed it yet. "I don't know how to be anything else." Regina's eyes softened, her grip on his hand tightening slightly. "Then take your time figuring it out." They sat there in the early morning light, watching as the sun rose higher, as the city continued to move, to breathe, to rebuild itself from the ruins Novak had left behind. Zion didn't know where he was going next, didn't know if he would stay, didn't know if the road would call to him again, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. Regina gave his hand one final squeeze before picking up her coffee again, taking another slow sip as she watched the world wake up. "Sun's up," she murmured, tilting her head toward the skyline. "Brand new day." Zion exhaled, letting his body relax just a little. For the first time, he let himself believe it. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.